Richard Crane slammed his fist on the mahogany desk so hard that his coffee cup shattered against the floor. "I don't care if she's 9 months pregnant," he snarled into the phone. "I don't care if she's carrying triplets. That woman is standing between me and $3 billion worth of minerals. Find something. Create something. I want her off that property before the first snow falls, or I swear to God I will bury everyone in this room." His assistant backed toward the door, but Crane wasn't finished. "Her grandmother thought she could outlast me. She died trying. This one..." He laughed cold and sharp. "This one has nothing. No money, no husband, no friends. She's 8 months pregnant and living in a house that should have been condemned 20 years ago. Break her. I don't care how. Just break her." What Richard Crane didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had already found the one thing that could destroy him, and she was about to use it. Before we begin this incredible story, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel and follow Sarah's journey to the very end. Drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Now let's begin. Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against her swollen belly and stared at the eviction notice in her other hand. The words blurred together through her tears, but she'd read them enough times to know what they said. 30 days. She had 30 days to find somewhere else to exist. "Ma'am, you need to clear the premises," the sheriff's deputy said. He wouldn't look at her face. "I'm sorry, I really am." "Where am I supposed to go?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I'm 8 months pregnant. My husband died 6 months ago. I have $43 in my bank account and a car that might not start tomorrow." The deputy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "There's a shelter on 5th Street. They take women in your situation." "My situation?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what we're calling it now, my situation? Ma'am, please, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." Sarah looked at the apartment behind her. 3 rooms that had held her entire life with Daniel. The couch where they'd watched movies every Sunday night. The kitchen where he'd burned pancakes on their anniversary because he wanted to surprise her. The bedroom where they'd talked about baby names until 2 in the morning, never knowing he wouldn't live to meet their daughter. "Can I have 5 minutes?" she asked. "Just to say goodbye?" The deputy checked his watch. 5 minutes, then I need to lock the door." Sarah walked through the apartment one last time. She touched the wall where Daniel had hung their wedding photo. She stood at the window where she used to watch for his truck coming home from work. She pressed her hand against the nursery door, the room they'd painted yellow together, the room that would never hold their baby now. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty space. "I'm so sorry I couldn't hold on." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press the green button. "Mrs. Mitchell? Mrs. Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes." "This is Harold Whitmore of Whitmore & Associates in Highland Springs, Virginia. I'm calling about your grandmother, Grace Eleanor Mitchell." Sarah's chest tightened. "My grandmother, I haven't spoken to her in 17 years. My mother..." "I know about the estrangement, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm sorry to inform you that Grace passed away 3 weeks ago." The world tilted. Sarah grabbed the doorframe to steady herself. Her grandmother was dead. The woman who had taught her to make biscuits, who had rocked her on the porch swing during summer storms, who had written letters every month for years until Sarah's mother threw them away unopened. Dead. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." "Your grandmother left a will. You're the sole beneficiary. She's left you the Mitchell farmstead, the house, the land, everything. 127 acres in Highland County." Sarah sank to the floor. The deputy appeared in the doorway, tapping his watch, but she held up one finger. "I don't understand," she said. "My mother said my grandmother disowned us." "Your mother was mistaken, or perhaps she told you what she wanted you to believe. Either way, the property is yours. It's been waiting for you." Sarah looked around the empty apartment at the boxes stacked by the door, at the life that was ending, whether she was ready or not. "Mr. Whitmore, how soon can I take possession?" "Immediately. The deed is ready to transfer whenever you arrive." Sarah closed her eyes. A farmhouse she barely remembered. A grandmother who had died alone. An inheritance she didn't deserve and couldn't explain. "I'll be there tomorrow," she said. The drive from Richmond took 4 hours, but it felt like traveling through time. Every mile took Sarah further from the life she'd known and deeper into a past she'd tried to forget. Her mother had fled these mountains like they were on fire, had sworn they'd never go back, had raised Sarah to believe that the Mitchell farm was poison and anyone who stayed there was cursed. But Sarah's mother was dead too, buried in Phoenix 3 years ago, still bitter about a childhood she'd never explained. And now Sarah was 8 months pregnant, completely alone, and driving toward the only thing she had left in the world, a falling down farmhouse, and the ghost of a woman she'd loved and lost. The road wound up through the Blue Ridge, climbing higher and higher until Sarah's ears popped with the altitude. The trees pressed close on either side, their leaves just starting to turn gold and orange. She hadn't seen mountains like this in almost 2 decades. She'd forgotten how they made her feel small and safe at the same time. Her phone lost signal somewhere past Staunton. The GPS went dark, but Sarah didn't need directions. Her body remembered the way the turns and curves she'd traced as a child, leaning against the car door while her mother drove them up for summer visits, and then away again, always away, until the day they left for good. The farmhouse appeared through the October mist like something from a dream. Sarah pulled onto the gravel drive and stopped the car. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. The house looked exactly the same as it had 17 years ago, but also completely different. Smaller somehow. Older. Tired in a way that made her chest ache. The paint had peeled away in long strips. The porch sagged in the middle. 2 of the front windows were boarded over. But the chimney still stood straight, and the front door was still painted that faded red she remembered the color her grandmother had called barn blood, because she said it kept the evil spirits away. Sarah climbed out of the car slowly, one hand supporting her belly. Her daughter kicked hard as if she knew something important was happening. "This is it," Sarah said out loud. "This is where we came from." She walked up the path past flower beds that had gone wild with neglect, past the old bird bath cracked down the middle, past the porch swing still hanging from its rusted chains. Every step felt like walking backward through years, like time itself was folding around her. The key was in the envelope the lawyer had mailed, an old iron skeleton key that weighed more than modern keys that felt serious and permanent in her palm. Sarah slid it into the lock, held her breath, and turned. The door swung open with a sigh. The smell hit her first, and Sarah burst into tears before she could stop herself. Wood smoke and lavender and dust, the exact smell of her grandmother's hugs, the exact smell of safety and love and everything she'd lost when her mother drove them away. "Grandma?" she whispered, knowing it was foolish, knowing no one would answer. "I'm home. I'm finally home." The house creaked around her, settling, and Sarah chose to believe it was welcome. She spent the first night sleeping on her grandmother's bed, wrapped in quilts that smelled like cedar and old roses. She hadn't meant to stay in that room. She'd planned to find clean sheets to air out one of the smaller bedrooms, to be practical and organized the way she'd learned to be. But the moment she walked into her grandmother's room, she couldn't leave. The bed was still made, the pillows still dented. Dented from a head that had rested there. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, dusty now, but still holding the ghost of a final drink. A pair of reading glasses lay folded on top of a Bible that had been worn soft with use. Grace Mitchell had died in this bed, surrounded by the things she loved. And now her granddaughter lay in the same spot, pressing her face into pillows that still held a faint trace of rose perfume, crying for a woman she'd been taught to forget. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry I didn't come back sooner. I'm sorry I believed what Mom told me. I'm sorry for everything." The baby kicked hard and insistent. "I know," Sarah said, placing her hand where the tiny foot pressed against her from inside. "I know. We're here now. That's what matters." The next morning, Sarah woke to someone pounding on the front door. She stumbled out of bed, disoriented, her back aching from the unfamiliar mattress. The pounding continued, aggressive and impatient. "Hold on," Sarah shouted, wrapping her grandmother's robe around her shoulders. "I'm coming." She pulled open the door and found herself face to face with a man in a suit that cost more than her car. He was small and thin, with pale eyes and thinning hair, and he smiled at her in a way that made her stomach clench. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said. "What a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Richard Crane." Sarah knew that name. She'd heard it somewhere, read it somewhere, but her sleep-fogged brain couldn't place it. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. "I make it my business to know things, Mrs. Mitchell, especially things related to this property." His eyes traveled over her, pausing at her belly. "I see congratulations are in order. When are you due?" "That's none of your business?" "Perhaps not, but this property is very much my business." "Sami?" Crane stepped closer, and Sarah had to fight the urge to step back. "I had an arrangement with your grandmother, a business arrangement. I was hoping we could continue it." "I don't know anything about any arrangement." "No, I don't suppose you would. Your grandmother was a secretive woman, but I'm sure once you've had a chance to settle in, once you've seen the condition of this house and the land, you'll be eager to discuss your options." Sarah crossed her arms over her chest. What kind of options? Selling, of course. This property is worth a great deal of money, Mrs. Mitchell, more than you might imagine. I'm prepared to offer you $5 million cash with a 30-day closing. The number hung in the air between them. $5 million. More money than Sarah had ever dreamed of. Enough to raise her daughter in comfort to never worry about eviction notices or empty bank accounts again. Why? She asked. Crane's smile flickered. Excuse me. Why would you pay $5 million for a falling-down farmhouse and some overgrown fields? What's really going on here, Mr. Crane? Something shifted behind Crane's pale eyes, something cold and calculating. I'm a developer, Mrs. Mitchell. I see potential where others see decay. This land could be transformed into something magnificent. Golf courses, luxury homes, a resort that would bring jobs and prosperity to this entire region. And my grandmother refused to sell. Your grandmother was stubborn. She had sentimental attachments that clouded her judgment. But you're young, you're practical, and you're about to have a child to provide for. Crane reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Think about it. Really think about it. $5 million would change your life, and staying here... He looked past her into the dim interior of the house. Staying here will only break your heart. He placed the card in her hand, holding on just a moment too long. I'll give you a week, he said. Then I'll be back for your answer. He walked to his car, a black Mercedes SUV that looked absurdly out of place on the gravel drive. Sarah watched him go, his card still clutched in her fingers. $5 million. A week. What had her grandmother gotten her into? Sarah spent the rest of that day exploring the house, trying to understand the scope of what she'd inherited. The farmhouse was bigger than she remembered, room after room, opening onto more rooms, each one filled with the accumulated possessions of generations. The kitchen was a disaster. The wood stove had rusted. The refrigerator had died months ago, and no one had cleaned it out. Mice had gotten into the pantry and destroyed half the supplies. But the bones were good, the counter solid, the windows still intact. The living room held furniture that had probably been in place since the Civil War. The dining room table could seat 12, though Sarah couldn't imagine who had last sat around it. The study at the back of the house was packed with boxes and papers and books stacked so high she could barely open the door. Upstairs, she found 4 bedrooms, each one frozen in a different era. Her mother's childhood room still had posters on the walls from bands that had broken up decades ago. The guest rooms held beds that had been made with military precision and never slept in since. And at the end of the hall, in the smallest room at the front of the house, Sarah found the nursery. She stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. The room had been prepared. Recently, the walls were painted a soft yellow. A mobile hung from the ceiling carved wooden birds that spun slowly in the draft from the window. And in the corner, polished and gleaming, stood an iron cradle with curved rockers and spindles worn smooth by countless small hands. Sarah walked forward as if in a dream. The cradle was antique and possibly old, but the mattress inside was new, still wrapped in plastic. A hand-sewn quilt lay folded at the foot, done in a pattern of interlocking stars that Sarah recognized from photographs of quilts made by women who had been dead for a century. And tucked into the folds of the quilt was an envelope with her name written on it in handwriting she knew as well as her own. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. My dearest Sarah. The letter began, and Sarah had to sit down on the floor because her legs wouldn't hold her. If you're reading this, then I've finally gone on to join your grandfather and all the others who went before. I'm sorry I couldn't wait for you. I tried. Lord knows I tried. Every day for 17 years I waited for you to come home. Every day I set an extra place at the table just in case. Every day I walked to the mailbox hoping for a letter that never came. I don't blame you, sweetheart. I know your mother filled your head with lies about me, about this place, about everything we've protected for nearly 200 years. She had her reasons. I didn't agree with them, but I understood them. Some people aren't built to carry the burdens our family has carried. Some people need to run. Your mother was one of those people. But you're not. I knew it when you were small, the way you listened to stories about our ancestors, the way you touched the walls of this house like you were learning their secrets. You have the gift, Sarah, the gift of staying, the gift of protecting what matters. There are things I need to tell you about this land, things I should have told you in person, but time ran out. I always thought I'd have more time. That's the cruelest trick of old age. You think you have forever, and then one day you realize you have nothing left at all. Start with the root cellar. Look for the journal with the blue leather cover. It will tell you where to find what I've hidden. It will explain why men like Richard Crane want this land so desperately and why you must never ever let them have it. Protect this place, Sarah. Not because it's valuable, though it is. Not because it's old, though it is that too. Protect it because what lies beneath this soil is more important than you can imagine. Protect it because our family has been guardians of something precious since 1847, and now that duty passes to you. I believe in you. I always have, and when the time comes, you'll know what to do. With all my love across all the years, Grandma Grace. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she pressed it against her chest and wept great heaving sobs that shook her entire body and made her daughter kick in protest. "What did you get me into, Grandma?" she whispered. "What am I supposed to protect?" The house creaked around her. The mobile spun slowly overhead, casting shadows of birds across the walls. And somewhere deep beneath the floor, water flowed through darkness, keeping secrets that had been waiting nearly 2 centuries to be found. The root cellar entrance was hidden behind a cabinet in the pantry. Sarah found it by accident, reaching for a can of soup and knocking against a wall that sounded hollow. She pulled, and finally found the latch disguised as a hook for hanging pots. The cabinet swung outward, revealing a wooden door set into the floor. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Part of her wanted to close the cabinet, forget what she'd found, take Crane's money, and run. But she could hear her grandmother's voice in her head, clear as if Grace were standing beside her. "You're not a runner, Sarah. You never were." She pulled open the door. Stone steps descended into darkness. Cold air rushed up, carrying the smell of earth and something else, something ancient and clean, like water from a spring that had never seen sunlight. Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and started down. The steps were steep, but even worn smooth by generations of feet. She counted them as she descended 10, 15, 20. The walls were close enough to touch cool stone that guided her deeper into the earth. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small chamber lined with wooden shelves. The shelves held jars of preserves, mostly spoiled now, and boxes of documents and stacks of journals bound in leather of various colors. Sarah found the blue one immediately. It sat on the middle shelf at eye level, as if her grandmother had placed it there specifically to be found. She opened it. The first entry was dated March 15, 1847, written in handwriting so old and formal that Sarah had to read each sentence twice. "We have arrived at last at our new home in the Virginia mountains. The journey from Pennsylvania took 3 weeks and cost us 1 horse and most of our provisions, but we are here. Thomas says the land is good. I say it is wild and strange and full of secrets. The spring that flows from the base of the ridge is the sweetest water I have ever tasted. Thomas believes we can build something lasting here. I believe him. I have to believe him. We have nowhere else to go." Sarah turned pages, scanning entries that documented the early years of the Mitchell farm. Eleanor Mitchell, her great-great-great-grandmother, had been a meticulous record keeper. She wrote about planting crops and birthing children, about neighbors who helped, and neighbors who didn't, about winters that nearly killed them, and summers that made all the suffering worthwhile. Then Sarah found an entry from September 1852 that made her stop breathing. "Thomas found something today. He was digging a new well near the north field when his shovel struck stone in a way that did not sound like ordinary stone. He dug deeper and found an opening. A cave, he says, though cave seems too simple a word for what he described. He says there is water down there, more water than he's ever seen, flowing through the rock in rivers that have never seen the sun. He says we cannot tell anyone. He says men would come from everywhere to take it from us if they knew. I trust him. I have always trusted him. But I do not like secrets. Secrets have a way of growing teeth." Sarah's hands were trembling now. She flipped forward, looking for more information, and found it in an entry from November 1852. "I have seen it now. Thomas took me down. I cannot describe what it felt like to stand in that chamber, surrounded by stone that had been there since before God made Adam. The water glows, Sarah. I do not know how else to say it. The minerals in the rock catch what little light there is and hold it like the water is lit from within. Thomas says this spring feeds every well in the valley. He says if anyone poisoned it or drained it, everyone for miles around would die. He says we have been given a sacred trust. He says we must protect it forever." Sarah closed the journal. Her heart was racing. Her daughter kicked hard and insistent. "A sacred trust," she whispered. "An underground spring that feeds the whole valley. And men like Richard Crane who want to get their hands on it." She understood now. She understood why her grandmother had refused to sell. She understood why Crane was willing to pay $5 million for a falling-down farmhouse. She understood why her mother had run away and never come back. This wasn't just land. This wasn't just a house. This was something precious. Something irreplaceable, something that thousands of people depended on, without even knowing it existed. And now it was hers to protect. The next morning, Thomas Harwell showed up at her door. He was older than she expected, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He held a casserole dish in one hand and a folder in the other, and he smiled at Sarah like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. "You must be Sarah," he said. "Your grandmother talked about you every single day. She never stopped believing you'd come home." Sarah took the casserole dish, not sure what else to do. "Did you know her well?" "Better than anyone, I think. My name is Thomas Harwell. I was the deputy sheriff here for 30 years before I retired. Your grandmother and I were friends, good friends. She trusted me with things she didn't trust to anyone else." Like what's under this land, Thomas's expression didn't change. But something shifted behind his eyes. "You found the root cellar." "I found the journal, the blue one." "Then you know more than most." Thomas looked past her into the house. "May I come in? There are things we need to discuss. Things your grandmother wanted me to tell you if anything happened to her before you came home." Sarah stepped aside to let him enter. They sat at the kitchen table, the casserole cooling between them, while Thomas told Sarah everything her grandmother had shared with him over 30 years of friendship. The aquifer, the conservation easement from 1956, the parade of developers and mining companies who had tried to buy the property over the decades, the threats, the pressure, the never-ending attempts to force the Mitchells off their land. "Your grandmother fought them all," Thomas said. "She was the most stubborn woman I ever met, and I say that with nothing but respect. She knew what she was protecting, she knew why it mattered, and she never not once considered giving up." "But she died," Sarah said. "She died alone in this house with no one to help her." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She died on her own terms, in her own bed, in the house her ancestors built. That was what she wanted, Sarah. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was only afraid of dying before you came home." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I didn't know. My mother told me Grandma had disowned us. She told me we weren't welcome here anymore." "Your mother told you a lot of things that weren't true. She was running from something she didn't want to face. Some people can't handle the weight of responsibility. Your mother was one of them." Thomas leaned forward. "But you're not. I can see it in your eyes. You're a fighter, just like Grace." "I'm 8 months pregnant, broke, and living in a house that's falling apart. I don't feel like much of a fighter." "Neither did your grandmother when she started. She was 23 years old when her parents died and left her this place. She didn't know about the aquifer. She didn't know about any of it. She learned. She adapted. She became the guardian this land needed." Thomas reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You can do the same. I'll help you. There are others who will help too. You're not alone." Sarah looked at this man she'd just met, this stranger who knew more about her family than she did, and felt something loosen in her chest. "Crane came to see me yesterday," she said. "He offered $5 million. Thomas's expression hardened. "He's been circling this property for 20 years. Your grandmother refused him every time. He's tried everything. Legal challenges, tax liens, code violations, anonymous complaints. He even tried to have her declared mentally incompetent 2 years ago." "What?" "He filed papers claiming she wasn't capable of managing her affairs. Said she was a danger to herself and the community. I had to testify on her behalf. So did half the town." Thomas shook his head. "Crane doesn't care who he hurts. He doesn't care what he destroys. All he sees is the money he could make if he got his hands on what's under this land." "What exactly is under this land?" "Minerals. Rare earth elements worth billions of dollars. They're above the aquifer in the rock formations that feed into it. If anyone tried to mine them, they'd destroy the water supply for 5 counties. Thousands of wells would go dry. Farms that have been here for generations would fail. The entire region would be devastated." Sarah thought about the families she'd seen on the drive up the small farms dotting the hillsides, the children playing in yards. All of them drinking water that came from somewhere they'd never seen, depending on a resource they'd never known existed. And Crane knows this. He knows, he doesn't care. He figures he'll be long gone by the time the damage shows up. That's how men like him operate. They take what they want and leave the mess for everyone else to clean up. Sarah stood and walked to the window. Outside, the mountains rolled toward the horizon, ancient and patient and impossibly beautiful. Her grandmother had stood at this same window, looking at this same view, carrying this same burden. "I'm not selling," Sarah said. "I don't care how much he offers. I'm not selling." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw tears in his eyes. "Your grandmother would be proud of you. My grandmother would tell me I'm being an idiot. I don't have any money, any resources, any way to fight someone like Crane. He could crush me without breaking a sweat." Maybe, but you have something he doesn't. What's that? The truth, the documents, the proof of what's really at stake. Thomas picked up the folder he'd brought with him. Your grandmother gave me these before she died. She said to give them to you when you came. She said you'd know what to do with them. Sarah took the folder and opened it. Inside were decades of correspondence. Letters from Crane's company offering increasing amounts of money. Legal notices challenging the easement. Geological surveys that contradicted the government's findings. And beneath all of that, a collection of photographs and documents that trace the history of the aquifer from its discovery in 1852 to the present day. This is everything, Sarah said. This is everything your grandmother could gather. She spent the last 10 years of her life building this file. She knew Crane wouldn't stop. She knew he'd come back again and again until he got what he wanted. She wanted you to be prepared. Sarah looked at the documents at the evidence of a war that had been fought in silence for longer than she'd been alive. Her grandmother had been a general commanding a campaign that no one else even knew existed, and now the command was passing to her. I need to see it, she said. The spring, the aquifer, whatever's down there. I need to see it with my own eye. Thomas nodded slowly. I can show you, but Sarah, once you see it, there's no going back. You'll understand why your grandmother gave her life to protecting it, and you'll understand why you have to do the same. I already understand, Sarah said. Take me there. The entrance to the spring house was hidden beneath an ancient oak tree at the edge of the north field. Thomas led Sarah across the property, pointing out landmarks as they walked the old barn where her grandfather had kept horses, the stone wall built by the first Mitchells to claim this land, the creek that ran down from the ridge and disappeared into the earth. The water you see on the surface is just a fraction of what's below, and Thomas explained. The aquifer is massive. It stretches for miles in every direction, fed by underground rivers that have been flowing since before humans existed. They reached the oak tree, its trunk so wide that Sarah couldn't have wrapped her arms around it. The rope swing still hung from one of the lower branches, frayed but intact. I used to swing here when I was little, Sarah said. Grandma would push me for hours. She loved that swing, said it was the best place on the property for thinking. Thomas walked around the tree, brushing aside branches and dead leaves. The entrance is here. Your grandmother showed me years ago. He pressed against a section of bark, and Sarah heard a click. A panel of wood swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. This was built by Thomas Mitchell, the first one in 1853. He spent 2 years constructing it in secret, working only at night so no one would see. He was terrified that someone would discover what he'd found and try to take it from him. Sarah peered into the darkness. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else, something clean and ancient. Is it safe? She asked, one hand on her belly. The passage is stable. Your grandmother reinforced it 20 years ago, but it's steep and be careful. Sarah nodded and started down. The stairs were carved from the rock itself, each one worn smooth by generations of feet. Sarah counted them as she descended, holding the wall for balance, feeling the temperature drop with every step. 30 stairs, 40, 50, and then the passage opened up and Sarah gasped. She stood at the edge of an underground chamber larger than any room she'd ever seen. The ceiling arched overhead, lost in shadows. The walls were covered with mineral deposits that caught the beam of her flashlight and threw it back in 1,000 directions, creating the illusion of stars in an underground sky. And at the center of the chamber, glowing with a soft blue-green light that seemed to come from within, was a pool of water so clear and still that it looked like liquid glass. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. Thomas appeared beside her. "This is what your family has been protecting for almost 2 centuries. The source of the aquifer, the water that keeps this entire valley alive." Sarah walked forward slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The pool was larger than she'd realized, stretching back into the darkness fed by underground streams she could hear but not see. The glow came from the minerals in the rock phosphorescent compounds that had been absorbing and releasing light for millions of years. She knelt at the edge and dipped her fingers into the water. It was cold but not uncomfortable and so pure she could see the bottom clearly despite the depth. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Your grandmother used to come down here every week. She said it helped her remember why she was fighting, why it mattered. Thomas knelt beside her. The water from this spring feeds wells across 5 counties. Thousands of families depend on it without knowing it exists. If Crane gets his way, if he mines the minerals above this chamber, he'll collapse the structure. The water will be poisoned for generations. Everything your family has protected will be destroyed. Sarah watched the water flow ancient and eternal, indifferent to the struggles of the humans who lived above it. "I won't let that happen," she said. "I know you won't. But I don't know how to stop him. I'm one person. I'm pregnant. I have nothing." "You have this." Thomas gestured at the chamber around them. "You have the truth, and you have something else your grandmother left for you." He walked to the far wall where stone shelves had been carved into the rock. Sarah followed her flashlight, revealing boxes and journals and rolled documents, the accumulated records of nearly 2 centuries of guardianship. "Everything is here," Thomas said. "Every survey, every letter, every piece of evidence that proves what's at stake. Your grandmother spent her whole life building this archive. She wanted you to have it." Sarah ran her fingers along the spines of the journals. So many lives, so many years, so many people who had stood where she was standing now and made the same choice to protect something precious. "There's one more thing," Thomas said. He reached behind one of the boxes and pulled out a metal container sealed with wax and stamped with an official seal. "This is the original conservation easement from 1956. It's the legal document that prevents anyone from mining this land. As long as a Mitchell owns the property, it can't be challenged. But if you sell, Crane's lawyers will tear the easement apart. They'll claim it was improperly filed. They'll find technicalities, loopholes, anything they can. Your grandmother fought them off for years, but she was running out of resources, running out of time." Thomas handed her the container. "This is your weapon, Sarah, and this is your responsibility." Sarah held the container in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the weight of history, the weight of all the people who depended on water they'd never seen flowing through darkness they'd never know existed. "Crane said he'd be back in a week for my answer," she said. "Then you have a week to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "War." The week that followed was the most exhausting of Sarah's life. She threw herself into the house with a desperation that surprised her. She cleaned and repaired and organized, working until her back screamed and her feet swelled and her daughter kicked in protest. She couldn't fight Crane yet, couldn't challenge him directly, but she could make this place hers. She could claim it with sweat and effort and sheer stubborn will. Thomas came by every day, bringing supplies and advice and company. He introduced her to people who had known her grandmother, people who remembered Sarah as a child, people who were cautiously curious about the Mitchell girl who had finally come home. Martha Chen ran the hardware store in town. She remembered Grace Mitchell with obvious affection and slipped extra nails and screws into Sarah's bags without charging her. "Your grandmother helped my mother once," Martha said. "Years ago when no one else would. We don't forget things like that around here." Dr. Ellen Foster was the county historian, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had been working with Grace on a project about conservation in Highland County. "She never told me the full story," Ellen admitted, "but she gave me enough to know that this land is special, and she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd help whoever came next." Howard Briggs was the county code inspector, a gruff man who had known Sarah's grandmother for 30 years. "House is old but solid," he said after walking through every room. "Someone's been taking care of it. Don't let anyone tell you different." But not everyone was friendly. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when Sarah walked in. At the gas station, the attendant watched her like she might steal something. At the diner, she heard whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. "Mitchell girl, pregnant, no husband. Thinks she can just..." And everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. Watching, waiting, reporting back to someone. She knew who that someone was. Richard Crane returned exactly 1 week after his first visit, pulling up the drive in the same black SUV, wearing the same expensive suit, carrying the same cold smile. Sarah met him on the porch. She didn't invite him inside. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "I trust you've had time to consider my offer." "I have. And I'm not selling." Crane's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That's disappointing. I had hoped you'd be more reasonable than your grandmother." "My grandmother was the most reasonable person who ever lived. She understood what's at stake. She understood why this land matters. And now so do I." "Do you..." Crane stepped closer and Sarah had to fight the urge to retreat. "Do you really understand what you're turning down? $5 million, Mrs. Mitchell. Enough to raise your child in comfort. Enough to never worry about money again. Enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't come with a century of baggage and secrets. This land isn't baggage, it's heritage, and some things are more important than money." Crane laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. That's exactly what your grandmother used to say. Right up until the end, she clung to that ridiculous idea that she was protecting something precious. But do you know what she was really protecting, Mrs. Mitchell? Nothing. A hole in the ground. A trickle of water that could be replaced by modern infrastructure in a matter of months. You're lying. Have you actually seen what's under this property? Have you crawled down into that cave and looked at the pathetic little spring your family has worshipped for generations? It's nothing special, Mrs. Mitchell. It's just water, and there's plenty of water in the world. Sarah's hands clenched at her sides. The aquifer feeds wells across 5 counties. Thousands of families depend on it. Thousands of families for hunts who could easily be served by municipal water systems. Progress, Mrs. Mitchell. That's what I'm offering. A chance for this region to join the 21st century instead of clinging to the 19th. Crane's voice hardened. Your grandmother stood in the way of progress. She cost this community jobs development a chance at a better future, and she did it because she was afraid of change, because she was stubborn and small-minded and utterly incapable of seeing the big picture. Get off my property. Excuse me, you heard me. Get off my property, and don't come back. Crane stood very still for a moment. Then he smiled again, but this time there was no pretense of warmth. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Mitchell, a very serious mistake. Your grandmother had resources, friends, a lifetime of connections in this community. You have nothing, no money, no support, no way to fight me when I decide to take what I want. He leaned in close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and suffocating. And I always take what I want, in the end. He turned and walked back to his SUV. Before he got in, he called back over his shoulder, I'll give you one more week to reconsider. After that, I stop being polite. Sarah watched him drive away, her heart pounding, her daughter kicking hard against her ribs. 1 week. She had 1 week to prepare for whatever Crane was planning. She had no idea if it would be enough. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days later. Sarah woke to the sound of her phone ringing, an unknown number flashing on the screen. She answered, still half asleep, and heard a voice she didn't recognize. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Karen at the Highland County Tax Assessor's office. I'm calling about your property. Sarah sat up, suddenly alert. What about my property? We've discovered some irregularities in the records. It seems there are back taxes owed on the Mitchell farmstead, quite substantial back taxes. That's impossible. My grandmother was meticulous about paying her bills. I'm sure she was, but our records show outstanding obligations dating back several years. I'm afraid if these aren't resolved within 30 days, we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. Sarah's blood went cold. How much are we talking about? The woman named a figure that made Sarah's stomach drop. More than she had. More than she could possibly get. Enough to lose everything. There must be some mistake, Sarah said. Can you check your records again? I've checked them 3 times, Mrs. Mitchell. The figures are accurate. I'm sorry. The line went dead. Sarah sat in bed, staring at the phone in her hand, trying to process what had just happened. Back taxes, foreclosure, 30 days. Crane. This had to be Crane. She called Thomas immediately. Tax liens are one of his favorite tactics, Thomas said grimly. He's done this before. Bribed someone at the assessor's office to alter records, create phantom debts, anything to force a property into foreclosure. Can we prove it's fake? Your grandmother kept records of everything. Every payment, every receipt, every communication with the county. If the documents exist, they'll be in the house somewhere. Sarah spent the rest of that day tearing through her grandmother's files. The study was a disaster, boxes stacked on boxes, papers shoved into drawers and cabinets with no apparent organization. But slowly, methodically, she found what she needed: 20 years of tax receipts, all paid on time, all documented with copies and confirmations. She drove to the assessor's office the next morning with a folder full of evidence. The woman behind the counter, Karen looked at the documents with an expression that shifted from skepticism to confusion to what might have been embarrassment. These records show every payment going back to 1998, Sarah said. All of them processed and confirmed by this office. So either your computer system has a very serious glitch or someone has been tampering with official county records. Karen's face reddened. I'll need to look into this. Please do. And while you're looking, you might want to check whether anyone from the Crane Development Group has had access to your files recently, because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like fraud. Sarah left the office feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: powerful. She'd won a small battle. She'd proven that she couldn't be pushed around, but she knew the war was just beginning. The next attack came 2 days later. Sarah was in the kitchen making lunch when she heard a car pull up outside. She looked out the window and saw a county truck official seal on the door 2 men in uniforms climbing out with clipboards. "Code inspection," the first one said when she opened the door. "We've received complaints about safety violations on this property. I was just inspected 2 weeks ago. Howard Briggs cleared the house. We've received new complaints, ma'am. Serious ones. We need to look around." Sarah stepped aside, her jaw tight. "Go ahead." The inspectors walked through the house with a thoroughness that felt like invasion. They checked electrical outlets and plumbing fixtures and structural supports. They examined the roof and the foundation and the chimney. They took photographs and made notes and consulted with each other in whispers too quiet for Sarah to hear. Finally, after 2 hours, they handed her a list. "These are the violations we found, Jalgo," the lead inspector said. "They need to be addressed within 30 days or we'll be forced to condemn the property." Sarah looked at the list. Electrical wiring that didn't meet current code, a chimney that needed repointing, a porch railing that was structurally unsound, insulation issues, window seal failures, foundation cracks. The estimated cost of repairs was more than the tax bill had been. "This is harassment," Sarah said. The inspector shrugged. "We're just doing our job, ma'am." After they left, Sarah sat on the porch steps and cried. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt genuinely hopeless. Crane had money, he had connections, he had lawyers and accountants and officials in his pocket, and she had nothing but stubbornness and a falling-down farmhouse and a baby that could arrive any day now. "I can't do this," she whispered to her belly. "I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm just one person." Her daughter kicked hard and insistent. "I know," Sarah said through her tears. "I know, but knowing doesn't make it easier." She was still sitting there when Thomas pulled up. He took one look at her face and knew what had happened. "Crane," Sarah handed him the list. "Code violations, 30 days to fix them or they condemn the property." Thomas read through the list, his expression growing darker with each item. "Half of these are ridiculous. The house passed inspection 2 weeks ago. Howard wouldn't have missed this much." "It doesn't matter. They've got it on paper now. Official paper with official signatures." Thomas sat down beside her on the steps. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I was sheriff in this county for 30 years, he finally said. "I know people. I have favors I can call in. Let me see what I can do." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother was the best friend I ever had. She was kind when no one else was brave, when everyone else was scared, honest when everyone else was lying. She spent her whole life protecting something bigger than herself. I promised her Sarah. I promised her that if anything happened, I'd make sure whoever came next had a fighting chance." He turned to look at her, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "You're the next one. You're the one she waited for. And I'm not going to let her down." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to fight this. I don't know how to win." "Neither did your grandmother at first, but she learned, and so will you." Thomas stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, we've got work to do." The next 3 weeks were a blur of activity. Thomas called in every favor he was owed. Howard Briggs came back and did another inspection, documenting all the ways the previous report had been exaggerated or fabricated. Ellen Foster contacted colleagues at the university who were willing to testify about the importance of the aquifer. Martha Chen organized a group of local business owners who remembered Grace Mitchell and were willing to speak on her behalf. And Sarah did what Mitchell women had always done. She worked. She fixed what she could fix herself. Learning from YouTube videos and trial and error, she hired help for what she couldn't using money from a grant Thomas had found through a historic preservation society. She documented everything photographed. Everything. And built a case that showed exactly how Crane had tried to manipulate the system against her. The code violations were dismissed after Howard testified that the original report was fraudulent. The tax liens were dropped after Karen from the assessor's office admitted that the records had been altered by someone with system access who no longer worked for the county. But Crane wasn't finished. 2 days before Sarah's deadline, her power went out. She called the electric company and spent 4 hours on hold before finally reaching a human being who told her that her account had been flagged for non-payment. "That's impossible," Sarah said for what felt like the 100th time. "I paid my bill last week. I have the confirmation number right here." "I'm sorry, ma'am. Our records show the payment was rejected. You'll need to pay in person at our office to restore service." "Your office is 40 miles away. I'm 8.5 months pregnant. I can barely fit behind the wheel of my car." "I'm sorry, ma'am. Those are the rules." Sarah hung up and sat in the darkness listening to the wind rattle the windows. It was October, getting colder every day. She couldn't survive here without heat, without light, without a way to cook food or keep her baby warm when she arrived. For the first time since she'd started fighting, Sarah seriously considered giving up. She picked up Crane's business card still sitting on the kitchen table where she'd left it weeks ago. $5 million. A new start somewhere else. An end to all of this. Her daughter kicked. "I know," Sarah said. "I know, but what am I supposed to do? I'm out of options. I'm out of time. I'm out of everything." The house creaked around her. The wind died down for a moment, and in the silence, Sarah heard something she hadn't noticed before. Water. The sound of water flowing somewhere deep beneath the floor. She thought about her grandmother standing in the same kitchen facing these same kinds of attacks. She thought about Eleanor Mitchell, the first one hiding her discovery from neighbors who might steal it. She thought about all the women who had come between them, generation after generation, holding the line against people who wanted to take what wasn't theirs. They hadn't given up. Not one of them. Not ever. Sarah put down Crane's card. "Okay," she said out loud. "Okay, one more try." She grabbed her phone and called Thomas. "I need help," she said. "I need it right now." 20 minutes later, Thomas pulled up with a generator in the back of his truck. "Borrowed it from a friend," he said, already unloading it. "It'll keep the lights on until we can sort out the power company." While he worked on the generator, Sarah paced the kitchen, her mind racing. "This has to stop," she said. "Crane keeps coming after me sideways through taxes and codes and utilities. I keep putting out fires, but he keeps starting new ones. If we don't change the game, he's going to wear me down eventually." "What do you have in mind?" Sarah stopped pacing. "A town meeting, a public forum. We bring everything out into the open. The aquifer, the easement Crane's attacks. We show people what's really at stake." Thomas considered this. "It's risky. Crane has friends in this town. People who think development would be good for the economy. People who don't understand what they'd be losing." "Then we make them understand. We show them the documents. We explain what happens if the aquifer is destroyed. We give them a choice. And if they choose wrong..." Sarah put her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter shift inside her. "Then at least they'll know what they chose. At least we'll have tried." Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." "My grandmother would tell me I'm being stubborn and foolish and completely out of my depth." "Probably, but she'd be proud anyway." The town meeting was scheduled for the last Tuesday of October. Sarah spent every remaining day preparing. She organized the documents. She practiced her speech. She answered questions from reporters who had started to hear about the pregnant woman fighting a billion-dollar developer. And she watched the calendar counting down the days until her daughter was due, praying she'd have time to see this through before everything changed again. The night before the meeting, Sarah stood in the nursery looking at the cradle her grandmother had prepared. "Tomorrow I find out if any of this mattered," she said to her belly. "Tomorrow I find out if one person can really make a difference." Her daughter kicked hard enough to make Sarah wince. I know. She rubbed the spot where the tiny foot had connected. "We'll find out together." The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn. She dressed carefully in the nicest clothes she could still fit into. She reviewed her notes one last time. She ate breakfast even though her stomach was churning with nerves. And then she drove into town to the meeting that would decide everything. The community center was already packed when Sarah arrived. Every seat was taken. People lined the walls, crowded into the doorways, spilled out onto the sidewalk. She had never seen so many faces in one place, all of them turned toward her as she walked to the front of the room. Thomas was there, and Ellen and Martha and Howard. Her tiny army standing at the edges of the crowd ready to back her up. And in the back, watching with those pale, predatory eyes, stood Richard Crane. Sarah took her place at the podium. She looked out at the crowd. She took a deep breath, and she began. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. Most of you don't know me. I've only been back in Highland Springs for 2 months after being away for 17 years. But my family has been here since 1847. We've been part of this community for almost 200 years. And I'm here tonight to tell you something that most of you don't know. Something that your parents and grandparents probably didn't know either, because my family has been keeping it secret for a very long time." She told them everything: the aquifer, the discovery in 1852, the generations of Mitchells who had protected it in silence, the conservation easement, the decades of attacks from developers who wanted what was under the ground. She told them about Crane, the $5 million offer, the threats, the tax liens and code violations and power outages, the systematic campaign to force her off land that her family had held for almost 2 centuries. And she told them what was at stake. Every well in 5 counties is fed by this aquifer, Sarah said. Every farm, every home, every business, every family. If Richard Crane gets what he wants, if he mines the minerals above the water table, the contamination will spread for miles. Your wells will go dry, your crops will die. A way of life that has sustained this community for generations will end. She held up the documents from the spring house, the geological surveys and correspondence and evidence that proved everything she was saying. My grandmother spent her whole life protecting this resource. She died protecting it. And now I'm asking you to help me continue what she started. The room was silent when she finished. Then Richard Crane stood up. That was very moving, Mrs. Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. Very emotional, very dramatic. He walked toward the front of the room and people parted to let him pass. But I think we should deal in facts, not feelings. He reached the podium and turned to face the crowd, positioning himself beside Sarah as if they were equals presenting opposing sides of an argument. Yes, there's water under the Mitchell property. There's water under most properties in this region. It's not some mystical treasure. It's a geological feature. And yes, mining operations would require careful planning to avoid contamination. But modern technology makes that entirely possible. He smiled at the crowd, all charm and confidence. What Mrs. Mitchell isn't telling you is what development could mean for this community. Jobs, investment, economic growth. The tax revenue for my proposed project could fund new schools, better roads, expanded services. Highland Springs could become a destination, not just a place people pass through on their way somewhere else. At what cost? Sarah demanded. Progress always has a cost, Mrs. Mitchell, but the benefits far outweigh the risks. And frankly, I find it offensive that a woman who abandoned this community 17 years ago thinks she has the right to tell the rest of us what's best for our future. The crowd murmured, some nodded, some frowned. Sarah could feel the room shifting, feel Crane's arguments finding purchase. I didn't abandon anyone, Sarah said. I was taken away by a mother who was running from responsibility, and I came back the moment I could. How convenient that your return coincides with an inheritance worth millions. Crane's smile sharpened. Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, if I offered you $6 million instead of 5, would you suddenly find yourself more flexible? You could offer me $60 million, my answer would be the same. Then you're a fool. All pretense of charm dropped from Crane's voice. And fools don't last long against people like me. He turned back to the crowd. I'm not asking for a vote tonight. I'm just asking you to think. Think about what this community could become. Think about your children and grandchildren and the opportunities they'll never have if people like Sarah Mitchell keep this region trapped in the past. He walked back to his seat without looking at Sarah again. The room erupted into chaos. People shouting questions, arguments breaking out between neighbors, the chairman banging his gavel and calling for order. Sarah stood at the podium watching it all unfold, wondering if she'd won or lost. Then something unexpected happened. An old woman in the front row stood up. Sarah recognized her. Margaret Cole, the former mayor's wife, a pillar of the community for as long as anyone could remember. I knew Grace Mitchell for 63 years, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the noise. She was the most honest, most decent person I ever met, and she told me once years ago that the water under her land was the most precious thing in this county. More precious than gold. More precious than anything they could dig out of the ground. She turned to face Crane. I've also known you, Richard, or known of you, the farms you've ruined, the families you've displaced, the promises you've made and broken. You come here with your fancy suit and your smooth words, but I see what you are, and I won't be fooled. Margaret sat down. For a moment the room was silent. Then another voice spoke up, and another, and another. One by one, people stood to share their memories of Grace Mitchell, the times she'd helped them, the kindness she'd shown, the trust she'd earned over nearly a century of life in this community. And one by one, they declared their support for Sarah. The vote, when it finally came, wasn't even close. The county formally opposed any development of the Mitchell property. A committee was formed to explore permanent protection for the aquifer, and Richard Crane walked out without saying another word, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Sarah stayed until the last person left, shaking hands, accepting hugs, crying tears she didn't try to hide. Thomas found her on the steps outside, staring up at the stars. You did it, he said. We did it. All of us. Your grandmother would be so proud. Sarah smiled, but it was tired, and there was something else behind it. It's not over, she said. Crane won't give up. He'll find another way. Probably, but now you have something you didn't have before. What's that? Thomas gestured at the people still milling around the parking lot, the neighbors and friends and strangers who had chosen to stand with her. An army. Sarah put her hand on her belly. Her daughter was quiet finally after kicking throughout the entire meeting. "One more fight?" she whispered. "Just give me time for one more fight." She had no way of knowing that the biggest fight was still to come. 3 days after the town meeting, Richard Crane's lawyers filed suit in Highland County Circuit Court. Sarah found out when the process server knocked on her door at 6 in the morning, waking her from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. She signed for the envelope with hands that shook despite her best efforts to keep them steady. "What is it?" Thomas asked. He'd been staying in the guest room since the power incident, unwilling to leave Sarah alone with her due date approaching. Sarah read through the legal documents twice before she could answer. Crane is challenging the easement. He's claiming the 1956 filing was fraudulent. He says Robert Mitchell forged signatures and bribed county officials to get it recorded. That's insane. Robert Mitchell was the most honest man who ever lived. Ask anyone who knew him. Everyone who knew him is dead, Thomas. That's the point. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the papers spilling across the table. Crane isn't trying to win in court. He's trying to tie me up in legal battles until I run out of money, or time, or will to fight. Thomas picked up one of the documents and scanned it. His face went pale. "Sarah, look at this." She took the paper from his hand. It was a motion requesting an emergency injunction to prevent any transfer of property rights while the case was pending. If granted, Sarah wouldn't be able to sell, donate, or place the land in a conservation trust until the lawsuit was resolved. How long could that take, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Years, maybe decades if Crane keeps filing appeals? Sarah pressed her palms against her eyes. Her daughter kicked hard against her ribs as if protesting the stress her mother was under. "I need a lawyer," she said. "A real one. Someone who specializes in property law and isn't afraid of going up against Crane's money." "I know someone," Thomas said slowly. "But she's expensive. And she doesn't take cases she doesn't think she can win." "Call her. I'll figure out the money somehow." "Sarah?" "Call her Thomas. I didn't come this far to lose now." The lawyer's name was Victoria Chen, and she arrived at the farmhouse 2 days later in a car that was almost as expensive as Crane's. She was Martha's cousin, it turned out. The family resemblance was obvious in the sharp eyes and the no-nonsense way she walked through the front door like she owned the place. "Show me everything," Victoria said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Every document, every letter, every piece of evidence your grandmother collected." Sarah led her to the root cellar, then to the spring house, then back to the kitchen table where the boxes of papers had been organized and cataloged over the past weeks. Victoria read for 3 hours without speaking. Sarah made coffee, then tea, then more coffee. Thomas paced the living room. The baby kicked and kicked and kicked. Finally, Victoria looked up. "Crane doesn't have a case," she said. "The easement is solid. The signatures are authentic. I've seen 100 challenges like this, and they all fail." "Then why are you frowning?" Sarah asked. "Because Crane knows that. He's not stupid. If he's filing this lawsuit, it's not because he thinks he can win. It's because he wants something else." "Like what?" Victoria spread her hands. "That's what we need to figure out. What does Crane want badly enough to spend millions of dollars on a lawsuit he knows he'll lose?" Sarah thought about the spring house, about the aquifer flowing through darkness, about the minerals buried in the rock above abyss it worth billions if someone could figure out how to extract them without destroying the water supply. "Time," she said slowly. "He wants time. As long as the lawsuit is active, the property is in limbo. I can't protect it the way my grandmother did. I can't put it in a trust or donate it to a conservation organization. I'm stuck." "And while you're stuck," Sarah's blood went cold. "He finds another way in, another angle, another weakness." Victoria nodded grimly. "That's what I would do if I were him." The first attack came that same night. Sarah woke to the sound of breaking glass. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and ran to the window, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her car sat in the driveway, every window smashed. The word "leave" had been spray-painted across the hood in letters large enough to read from the porch. Thomas was beside her in seconds, his phone already in his hand. "I'm calling the sheriff." "Don't bother. They won't find anything. They never find anything." Sarah's voice was flat numb. She'd expected something like this. She'd just hoped she was wrong. "You can't stay here alone anymore." "I'm not alone. You're here." "I'm one man, Sarah, and I'm not young anymore." Sarah turned away from the window. Her hands were shaking again, and this time she couldn't make them stop. "I'm not leaving," she said. "If I leave, Crane wins. If I run, everything my grandmother fought for dies with her. Your grandmother would want you safe. She would want her great-granddaughter safe. My grandmother spent 91 years fighting people like Crane. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood her ground until her last breath." Sarah pressed her hand against her belly, feeling her daughter shift inside her. "I can do the same." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll make some calls. There are people in this town who owe your grandmother, people who might be willing to help keep watch." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This is going to get worse before it gets better." He was right. The following Tuesday, Sarah found a dead crow on her front porch. Someone had placed it on the welcome mat, arranged carefully with its wings spread wide. A note was pinned to its breast with a rusty nail, "Last warning." Sarah stared at the bird for a long time. She thought about fear, about what it meant to be afraid, about the difference between the fear that protected you and the fear that controlled you. Then she picked up the crow, carried it to the edge of the property, and buried it beneath the old oak tree. "You should tell the sheriff," Thomas said when she came back inside. "I should do a lot of things." Sarah washed her hands at the kitchen sink, scrubbing until her skin turned red. "Right now, I'm going to eat breakfast. Then I'm going to call Victoria and ask her to expedite our response to Crane's lawsuit. Then I'm going to take a nap because this baby is sitting on my bladder and I haven't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks." "Sarah, I know what Crane is doing, Thomas. He's trying to scare me into making a mistake. If I react, if I panic, if I do something stupid, he wins." She turned off the water and dried her hands with deliberate calm. "I'm not going to react. I'm not going to panic. And I'm definitely not going to do something stupid." But that afternoon, something happened that Sarah couldn't ignore. She was in the root cellar reorganizing documents for Victoria when she heard voices outside. Male voices, unfamiliar, speaking in the clipped tones of people who didn't want to be overheard. Sarah climbed the stairs as quietly as she could, her heart racing. Through the pantry window, she could see 2 men standing near the old oak tree. They wore work clothes and carried equipment she didn't recognize. She grabbed her phone and called Thomas. "There are men on my property, by the tree, the one that covers the entrance." "Stay inside, I'm 5 minutes away." "Thomas, they're looking for something. They have metal detectors or something." "Do not go outside, Sarah. Do you hear me? Stay in the house." But Sarah was already moving toward the back door. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't have a plan. All she knew was that those men were standing on top of her family's most precious secret, and she couldn't let them find it. "Hey," she shouted, stepping onto the porch. "This is private property. You need to leave." The men looked up. One of them said something to the other, too quiet for Sarah to hear. "I said leave. I'm calling the police." The first man started walking toward her. He was big, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been in too many fights. "Sorry, ma'am, we must have the wrong address. We'll be on our way." But he wasn't leaving. He was still walking toward her, his eyes fixed on her face, his hand reaching into his jacket. "Stop." Sarah's voice cracked. "Don't come any closer." The man smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Mrs. Mitchell, right, Mr. Crane sends his regards. He wanted me to tell you that his offer still stands. $5 million. You could be out of here by tomorrow. Start fresh somewhere nice, somewhere safe. I'm not selling. That's what your grandmother said." The man stopped, at the bottom of the porch steps. "Look how that worked out for her." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What did you say?" "I said, look how that worked out for her. Dying alone in this dump. No family, no friends, nobody to hold her hand at the end." The man shook his head in mock sympathy. "That's a hard way to go. You don't want that for yourself, do you? You don't want that for your baby." Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this stranger who had just confirmed her her worst fear. "You killed her," she whispered. "Crane killed my grandmother." The man laughed. Now, nobody killed anybody. Old ladies die all the time. It's natural, expected." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But accidents can happen to young ladies too, especially pregnant ones. Especially ones who stick their noses where they don't belong." The sound of a car engine cut through the air. Thomas's truck came roaring up the driveway, gravel spraying from the wheels. The man stepped back, his expression shifting to something almost friendly. "Think about what I said, Mrs. Mitchell. $5 million. A fresh start. It's a good deal. You won't get a better one." He walked back to his companion, and together they climbed into a white van that had been parked just out of sight behind the barn. By the time Thomas reached the porch, they were gone. Sarah, are you all right? What happened? Sarah couldn't answer. Her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She sank down onto the porch steps, her whole body shaking. They killed her, she said. They killed my grandmother. Crane killed her. What? What are you talking about? The man said. He said, look how that worked out for her. Dying alone. No family. No friends. Sarah looked up at Thomas, tears streaming down her face. What if he did something to her, Thomas? What if he hurt her somehow and made it look natural? Thomas sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. He didn't say anything for a long time. Your grandmother was 91 years old, he finally said. She died in her sleep. The coroner said it was natural causes. But what if it wasn't? What if Crane found a way to... Sarah. Thomas's voice was firm but gentle. I knew Grace for 30 years. She was tired at the end, ready to go. She told me so herself the last time I saw her. She said she'd done everything she could and now it was time to rest. But the man said what Crane wanted him to say. He's trying to get inside your head, trying to make you paranoid, make you doubt everything. Thomas turned her to face him. Don't let him win. Don't let him turn your grandmother's peaceful death into something ugly. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know what to believe anymore. Believe this, your grandmother loved you. She waited for you, she prepared a place for you and your daughter, and she trusted you to finish what she started. Thomas squeezed her shoulders. That's what matters. That's the truth. Everything else is just noise. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her grandmother's bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every whisper of wind sounded like voices. At 3 a.m, she got up and went down to the kitchen. She made tea she didn't want just to have something to do with her hands. The folder from Victoria sat on the table full of legal documents and case histories and strategies for fighting Crane's lawsuit. Sarah flipped through it absently, not really reading, just letting her eyes move across the pages. A name caught her attention. She stopped. Backed up, read more carefully. It was a newspaper clipping from 12 years ago. A story about a farm in West Virginia that Crane had acquired after the owner died unexpectedly. The man had been 78 years old, in perfect health, and he'd refused to sell to Crane for over a decade. Then one night he'd fallen down his basement stairs and broken his neck. Accident, the coroner had ruled. Natural causes. The farm had been sold to Crane's company 3 months later. Sarah kept reading. There were more clippings, more stories, more unexpected deaths of elderly landowners who had refused to cooperate with Richard Crane's development plans. An 82-year-old woman in Tennessee who drowned in her bathtub. A 76-year-old man in Kentucky who died of an apparent heart attack. A 90-year-old widow in North Carolina who simply didn't wake up one morning. All of them had owned land that Crane wanted. All of them had refused to sell. All of them had died within months of their final refusal. And all of their properties had ended up in Crane's hands. Sarah's stomach heaved. She made it to the sink just in time, retching up the tea she'd barely touched. "Oh God," she whispered when she could speak again. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." Her grandmother hadn't just died. She'd been murdered. Sarah was certain of it now. And if Crane had killed once, twice, a dozen times, he would kill again. He would kill her. Sarah pressed her hands against her belly, feeling her daughter move inside her. "I won't let him," she said out loud. "I won't let him hurt you. I won't let him hurt either of us." She grabbed her phone and called Victoria Chen. "It's 4 a.m, Victoria said, her voice thick with sleep. "I know, I'm sorry, but I found something. Something that changes everything." She told Victoria about the clippings, about the pattern, about what she suspected. Victoria was quiet for a long time after Sarah finished. "This is serious," she finally said. "If what you're suggesting is true, we're not just talking about property disputes anymore. We're talking about murder." "I know." "You need to go to the police, the FBI, someone with the authority to investigate. And say what? That I think a billionaire developer has been killing elderly landowners for 20 years, with what proof, newspaper clippings, and a gut feeling. Sarah, you know I'm right. No one will believe me. Not without hard evidence, not without something that directly links Crane to these deaths." Victoria sighed. "What do you want me to do? Help me find that evidence, dig into these cases, find the connection. There has to be something. That's not really my area of expertise. I don't care. You have resources I don't. Contacts I don't. I'm asking you, Victoria, please." Another long silence. Then, I'll see what I can do. But Sarah, you need to be careful. If Crane really is what you think he is, you've just become much more than an obstacle. You've become a threat. I know, Sarah said. That's what scares me. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Sarah's life. Victoria hired a private investigator to look into the death Sarah had found. The investigator found more cases. Many more. A pattern that stretched back almost 30 years across 6 states involving at least 24 unexplained deaths. But pattern wasn't proof. Coincidence wasn't evidence. And Richard Crane had lawyers whose entire job was making inconvenient information disappear. Meanwhile, the lawsuit ground forward. Hearings were scheduled. Depositions were demanded. The legal costs mounted, eating through the grant money Sarah had received for the house repairs. The town remained divided. Some people supported Sarah without question, showing up at the farm to help with chores or bringing food or simply sitting with her so she wouldn't be alone. Others sided with Crane, believing his promises of jobs and development, resenting the outsider who had returned to tell them what they could and couldn't do with their community. And through it all, Sarah's belly grew larger. Her due date came and went. The baby settled deeper into her pelvis, pressing on nerves that made her legs go numb at random moments, making every step an adventure. Any day now, the midwife said at Sarah's last checkup. Your body is ready. The baby is ready. It's just a matter of time. How much time? Sarah asked. The midwife smiled. Babies come when they come, not before, not after. They have their own schedule. That night, Sarah dreamed of water. She was standing in the spring house surrounded by the soft blue glow of the phosphorescent walls. The pool at the center was larger than she remembered. Deeper, stretching back into darkness that seemed to go on forever. And there was someone else there, a woman old and bent standing on the far side of the pool. She wore a dress that might have been white once long ago. Her face was in shadow, but Sarah knew who she was. Grandma. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there watching, waiting. Grandma, what do I do? How do I win this? The woman raised one hand and pointed, not at Sarah, at something behind her. Sarah turned. Richard Crane stood at the entrance to the spring house, his pale eyes glowing in the strange light. He smiled, and his teeth were sharp, and his smile was wrong, wrong, wrong. There's nowhere left to run, Mrs. Mitchell, he said. There's nowhere left to hide. He stepped forward, and the water in the pool began to rise. Sarah woke screaming. Thomas burst through the door, flashlight in hand. Sarah, what happened? Are you hurt? She couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but clutch her belly and shake. Just a dream, she finally managed. Just a nightmare. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a warning. The breakthrough came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Victoria called at noon, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. We found something. The investigator found something. What? One of the properties Crane acquired 15 years ago after the owner died. The man's daughter never believed her father's death was an accident. She hired her own investigator back then, someone who found evidence of tampering with the father's medication. Sarah's heart stopped. What kind of evidence? Traces of a compound that shouldn't have been there. Something that could induce a heart attack in someone with an existing condition. The daughter tried to take it to the police, but the evidence disappeared. The investigator was discredited. The case went nowhere. But she still has records. She has everything. She's been holding on to it for 15 years, waiting for someone else to connect the dots. Victoria paused. Sarah, she's willing to talk. She's willing to go public, but she's scared. She needs to know she won't be alone. She won't be. We'll stand together. There's more. The investigator found 2 other families with similar stories. People who suspected foul play but couldn't prove it. People who were silenced or ignored or paid off. Victoria's voice dropped. We're building a case, Sarah. A real case. One that could put Crane away for the rest of his life. Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for the first time in weeks they were tears of hope. How long until we're ready? A few more weeks, maybe a month. We need to coordinate the witnesses, compile the evidence, find a prosecutor willing to take on someone with Crane's resources. I don't know if I have a month. The baby. I know. I'm working as fast as I can. Sarah hung up the phone and pressed both hands against her belly. Her daughter was quiet for once, resting, conserving energy for the journey ahead. Just a little longer, Sarah whispered. Just hold on a little longer. But babies, as the midwife had said, keep their own schedule. The first contraction hit at 2 a.m, exactly 4 days after Victoria's call. Sarah had been sleeping fitfully, as she always did now, when a band of pressure wrapped around her midsection and squeezed. She gasped awake, clutching the sheets, waiting for it to pass. It took almost a minute. Then it released, and she could breathe again. False alarm, she told herself. Braxton Hicks, it's nothing. But 20 minutes later it happened again, and 20 minutes after that. By the time Thomas knocked on her door at 6, she was certain. It's time, she said. The baby is coming. Thomas went pale. Now, are you sure? I'm sure. Sarah gripped the doorframe as another contraction rolled through her. Call the midwife. Call Martha. Call anyone who can help. The hospital is an hour away. We should... I'm not going to the hospital. My grandmother was born in this house. My mother was born in this house. My daughter will be born in this house, too. Sarah met Thomas's eyes. This is where we belong. This is where it has to happen. The midwife arrived within the hour. Martha came shortly after, along with Ellen and 2 other women from town who had helped with difficult births before. Sarah labored through the morning walking when she could resting, when she couldn't, riding the waves of pain that came closer and closer together. At noon, her water broke. At 2 o'clock, the contractions were coming every 3 minutes. At 4 o'clock, she began to push. The pain was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It consumed her, overwhelmed her, made her forget everything else. There was only the pressure and the burning and the desperate need to bring her daughter into the world. You're doing great, the midwife said. The head is crowning. One more push, Sarah. One more big push. Sarah gathered everything she had left, every ounce of strength, every reserve of will. She thought about her grandmother laboring in the same room 60 years ago. She thought about her great-grandmother and her great-great-grandmother and all the Mitchell women who had come before bringing life into the world in this house that had sheltered them for almost 2 centuries. She pushed. And then suddenly, miraculously, it was over. A cry split the air, thin and high and absolutely alive. It's a girl, Huck, the midwife said, placing the baby on Sarah's chest. A beautiful, healthy girl. Sarah looked down at her daughter for the first time. The tiny face red and wrinkled. The eyes squeezed shut against the light, the mouth open wide, announcing her arrival to anyone who would listen. Hello, Sarah whispered. Hello, little one. I've been waiting so long to meet you. The baby opened her eyes. They were dark, almost black, but Sarah knew they would change. They would become gray-green like her own eyes, like her grandmother's eyes, like all the Mitchell women before them. What will you name her? Martha asked, tears streaming down her face. Sarah didn't hesitate. Grace Eleanor Mitchell, after the woman who made all of this possible. The room fell silent except for the baby's cries, which were already settling into soft whimpers as she found her mother's warmth. Thomas stood in the doorway, his weathered face wet with tears. Your grandmother would have loved this, he said. She would have loved her so much. She does love her, Sarah said. Wherever she is, she knows. She's watching, and she's proud. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains. The same sun that had set over this land for millions of years. The same sun that would continue to set long after everyone in this room was gone. But for now, in this moment, there was only a mother and her daughter beginning a new chapter in a story that had started almost 2 centuries ago. Sarah pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. Welcome to the fight, little Grace, she whispered. We have a lot of work to do. The baby opened her eyes and looked at her mother, and Sarah could have sworn she understood. The phone rang at midnight. Sarah was nursing Grace, still exhausted from the birth, but unable to sleep. Thomas answered it in the other room, his voice a low murmur she couldn't make out. When he appeared in the doorway, his face told her everything she needed to know. What happened? That was Victoria. Crane knows about the investigation. He knows about the witnesses. He knows everything. Sarah's arms tightened around her daughter. How? Someone talked. Someone in her office, maybe. Or one of the witnesses got scared and tried to make a deal. Thomas ran his hand over his face. Victoria says Crane's lawyers are already moving to discredit everything. The witnesses are being threatened. The evidence is being challenged. If we don't act fast, then we lose everything. Yes. Sarah looked down at her daughter, so small and fragile, so utterly dependent on her mother to keep her safe. For a moment, she wanted to give up, to take Crane's money and run, to find somewhere quiet and safe where no one knew her name or her history or the secrets buried under her land. But then Grace opened her eyes, and Sarah saw her grandmother looking back at her. No, she said, we don't run. We never run. Sarah, you just gave birth. You need to rest. You need to recover. I need to finish this. Sarah carefully shifted Grace to her other arm and reached for her phone. Call Victoria back. Tell her I want to go public. Tomorrow, before Crane can destroy anything else. Tomorrow? That's impossible. You can't. I can and I will. Sarah's voice was steel. My grandmother didn't fight for 90 years just to have me surrender in the last battle. Crane thinks he can wait me out. He thinks I'm weak. He thinks having a baby makes me vulnerable. She looked at Thomas with eyes that burned. He's wrong. Having a baby makes me dangerous. Because now, I'm not just fighting for land or water or family history. I'm fighting for her future. And there's nothing on this earth that I won't do to protect my daughter. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll make the calls. Thank you. He turned to leave, then stopped. Sarah, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know. Your grandmother chose the right person. She always knew you'd come back. She always knew you'd be the one to finish this. Sarah didn't trust her voice to answer. She just nodded. After Thomas left, she sat in the darkness with her newborn daughter, listening to the house settle around them. Tomorrow we fight, she whispered to Grace. Tomorrow we end this. And then I promise you we're going to live the life your great-grandmother dreamed of. A life of peace, a life of purpose, a life worth all the sacrifice it took to get here. Grace yawned and closed her eyes, already drifting back to sleep. Sarah held her close and waited for dawn. Dawn came gray and cold, the kind of November morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. Sarah hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the hours between midnight and sunrise nursing Grace, pacing the house and rehearsing what she would say when the cameras started rolling. Victoria had arranged everything. A press conference at the county courthouse, 3 networks confirmed, 2 newspapers, a reporter from a national magazine who had been investigating Crane's company for years but had never found enough evidence to publish. Now Sarah would give them everything. You don't have to do this today, Thomas said as he helped her into her coat. You just gave birth 18 hours ago. No one would blame you for waiting. Crane isn't waiting. Every hour I delay is another hour he has to destroy evidence and silence witnesses. Sarah adjusted the sling that held Grace against her chest. The baby was sleeping, oblivious to the storm about to break around her. Besides, this is better. A new mother fighting to protect her child. The optics are perfect. Thomas looked at her with something like wonder. When did you get so strategic? When I realized that being right isn't enough. You have to know how to make people care that you're right. They drove into town in Thomas's truck, Martha following in her car with Ellen and Victoria. The roads were empty this early, but Sarah could already see news vans parked outside the courthouse. Bigger turnout than I expected, Victoria said when they arrived. Word got out. Everyone wants to see the woman who's taking on Richard Crane. Is Crane here? Not yet, but his lawyers are, 3 of them. They've been trying to get the press conference shut down since 5 this morning. Sarah squared her shoulders. Let them try. The press conference was scheduled for 8 o'clock. By 7:30, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters' cameras and what looked like half the population of Highland Springs. Sarah saw faces she recognized from the town meeting. Some were supportive. Others were hostile. Most were simply curious. At 7:45, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Richard Crane stepped out. He was alone, no lawyers, no assistants, just a man in an expensive suit walking toward the courthouse like he owned it. Which Sarah thought bitterly he probably believed he did. Their eyes met across the crowd. Crane smiled, that cold, predatory smile that haunted her dreams. Sarah didn't look away. He's trying to intimidate you, Victoria murmured. Don't let him. He can try whatever he wants. I'm done being afraid. At 8 o'clock exactly, Sarah stepped up to the podium. The baby weight she hadn't lost yet pressed against her incision from a small tear during delivery. Her breasts ached with milk, her whole body screamed for rest. But her voice was steady when she began to speak. My name is Sarah Mitchell. 24 hours ago I gave birth to my daughter in the same house where my grandmother was born, and her mother before her going back almost 200 years. I should be home right now, resting with my baby. Instead, I'm here because a man named Richard Crane has spent the last 20 years trying to destroy everything my family has built. She told them about the aquifer, about the easement, about Crane's offers and threats and the systematic campaign to force her off her land. Then she told them about the deaths. In the past 30 years, at least 24 elderly landowners who refused to sell to Crane's company have died under suspicious circumstances. Heart attacks, falls, drownings, all ruled natural causes or accidents. All convenient for a man who profits from their deaths. The crowd murmured. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. I have evidence, Sarah continued. Documents witness statements, medical records that suggest these deaths were not accidents. I have families who have been waiting years for someone to listen to their stories. And I have this. She held up a flash drive. This contains correspondence between Richard Crane and members of his security team discussing ways to resolve situations with uncooperative property owners. It was provided to me by a former employee of Crane Development Group who could no longer stay silent. The crowd erupted. Richard Crane's face went pale. Mrs. Mitchell? A reporter pushed to the front. Are you accusing Richard Crane of murder? Sarah looked directly at Crane. I'm presenting evidence to the American public and asking them to draw their own conclusions. But yes, I believe Richard Crane is responsible for the deaths of multiple people, including quite possibly my own grandmother. Crane pushed through the crowd toward the podium. His lawyers tried to stop him, but he shook them off. This is slander, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. This woman is mentally unstable. She's grieving, she's sleep-deprived, and she's making wild accusations that have no basis in reality. Then you won't mind if the FBI investigates, Sarah said calmly. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. The FBI, Crane laughed, but there was an edge to it now. For what? Because some hillbilly with a grudge waves around a flash drive and makes up stories. This hillbilly has documentation going back 15 years. I have witnesses willing to testify. I have a pattern of deaths that stretches across 6 states. And I have you standing here sweating because you know that your house of cards is about to come down. Crane's face twisted. For just a moment, the mask slipped and Sarah saw what lay beneath. Pure naked hatred. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he said quietly, so only she could hear. You think this ends with a press conference. You think you can destroy me with a flash drive and some tearful testimony I've buried better people than you. Maybe, Sarah said just as quietly. But you've never faced a Mitchell woman who had nothing left to lose. Grace chose that moment to wake up. She let out a cry that cut through the tension, and suddenly every camera in the crowd swung toward the tiny face emerging from the sling. Sarah looked down at her daughter, then back at Crane. This is Grace Eleanor Mitchell. She was born yesterday in a house that has sheltered my family for almost 200 years. She will inherit that house and the land and the responsibility that comes with it. And she will grow up knowing that her mother stood on these steps and refused to be silent, refused to be intimidated, refused to let a murderer walk free. She turned back to the crowd. I'm asking for an investigation. I'm asking for justice. And I'm asking everyone who has ever been hurt by Richard Crane, everyone who has lost a family member or a farm or a future because of his greed to come forward. You're not alone anymore. None of us are. The press conference lasted another 45 minutes. Sarah answered questions until her voice gave out, then Victoria took over, walking the reporters through the evidence in meticulous detail. By the time it was over, Crane was gone. His SUV had disappeared from the curb sometime during Victoria's presentation. What happens now? Sarah asked as Thomas helped her back to the truck. Now we wait, Victoria said. I've already sent copies of everything to the FBI, the State Attorney General, and 3 separate news organizations. Even if Crane tries to suppress this, it's out there. He can't put it back in the box. And the lawsuit? Victoria smiled grimly. I expect we'll hear about that very soon. They heard about it 3 hours later. Sarah was home, finally resting Grace sleeping in the antique cradle beside the bed when Thomas knocked on the door. Crane's withdrawing the lawsuit. Sarah sat up too fast and winced. What? His lawyers just filed a motion to dismiss. No explanation, no conditions. They're just walking away. That doesn't make sense. Crane doesn't walk away from anything. Maybe he realizes he's beaten. Sarah shook her head slowly. Crane isn't beaten. He's regrouping. He's planning something. Like what? I don't know, but I know him well enough now to know that he doesn't give up. He just changes tactics. She was right to be worried. At 6 o'clock that evening, a different kind of knock came at the door. Sarah was in the kitchen warming soup when she heard it. Not the friendly knock of Thomas or Martha, something harder, more insistent. She looked through the window and felt her blood turn to ice. 4 men in dark suits stood on the porch. Behind them, 3 black SUVs blocked the driveway. Mrs. Mitchell? The man in front held up a badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Then training kicked in the instinct she'd developed over months of fighting for survival. About what we've received a complaint alleging that you've made false statements to federal investigators. We have a warrant to search your property and seize any documents related to your accusations against Richard Crane. A complaint from whom? The agent's expression didn't change. Mr. Crane's legal team has provided evidence suggesting that the documents you presented this morning were fabricated. We're required to investigate. Fabricated? Sarah's voice rose despite her best efforts. "I have witnesses. I have records going back 15 years. I have—" "Ma'am, I need you to step aside. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to slam the door in their faces and barricade herself inside. But she could hear Grace crying upstairs, woken by the commotion, and she knew that resistance would only make things worse. "Thomas," she called. "Thomas, I need you." The search took 4 hours. The FBI agents went through every room, every drawer, every box of documents Sarah and her grandmother had accumulated over generations. They took the flash drive. They took the files from Victoria's investigation. They took the journals from the root cellar, the correspondence from the spring house, the original conservation easement. They took everything. "This is theft," Thomas said as the agents loaded boxes into their vehicles. "This is a cover-up. Crane bought someone at the FBI, and now he's using them to destroy the evidence against him." "Maybe," one of the agents said, overhearing, "or maybe your friend made a mistake and she's about to face the consequences." Sarah stood on the porch holding Grace, watching her grandmother's life work disappear into the backs of black SUVs. "What happens now?" she asked. "You'll be contacted about further questioning. I'd recommend getting a lawyer, a good one." After they left, Sarah sat on the porch steps and tried to process what had just happened. "He turned it around," she said, her voice hollow. "I accused him of murder, and now I'm the one being investigated." "We have copies of everything," Thomas said. "Victoria has backups. The news organizations have copies. He can't destroy all of it." "He doesn't have to destroy all of it. He just has to create enough doubt. If people think I fabricated evidence, everything I said becomes suspect. Even the real evidence looks fake." "So what do we do?" Sarah looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the chaos around her. "We keep fighting. What else can we do?" The next 3 weeks were hell. The FBI investigation expanded. Sarah was called in for questioning twice, spending hours in a windowless room answering the same questions over and over. Victoria's license was suspended pending an ethics review. The witnesses who had agreed to come forward suddenly went silent, their lawyers citing concerns about retaliation. The news coverage shifted. The same reporters who had treated Sarah as a hero at the press conference now questioned her credibility, her motives, her mental state. One network ran a story about her history of homelessness, implying that she had invented the accusations against Crane as a way to keep the property she couldn't otherwise afford. "Public opinion is turning," Martha said during one of her daily visits. "People who supported you are starting to have doubts. And people who opposed me are feeling vindicated. Some of them, but not all." Martha leaned forward. "Sarah, there are still people in this town who believe you, people who remember your grandmother and trust her judgment. Don't give up on them." "I'm not giving up on anyone, but I'm running out of options. Victoria's suspended. The evidence is in FBI custody. The witnesses are scared. What am I supposed to do? What your grandmother would do: keep standing, keep fighting, wait for the moment when everything changes." That moment came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the FBI raid. Sarah was nursing Grace in the kitchen when her phone rang. The number was blocked. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Agent Jennifer Torres, FBI. I'm calling to inform you that the investigation into your allegations has been concluded." Sarah's heart stopped. "And we've determined that the evidence you provided was not fabricated. Furthermore, our investigation has uncovered additional evidence supporting your claims against Richard Crane." Sarah couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but grip the phone and wait. "Mrs. Mitchell, Richard Crane was arrested this morning. He's being charged with 12 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, along with numerous federal charges related to fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The arrests are ongoing. We expect to take more than 20 people into custody before the day is over." The phone slipped from Sarah's fingers. "Sarah," Thomas rushed in from the other room. "What happened? What's wrong?" Sarah looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "They got him. They finally got him." The news broke within the hour. Every network carried the story. Richard Crane handcuffed, being led from his office by federal agents. His lawyers, some of them also in handcuffs, following behind. Company executives, security personnel, the network of people who had helped him destroy lives and cover up murders for 3 decades. Sarah watched it all from her grandmother's living room, Grace sleeping in her arms. "They're saying it's the largest corruption case in Virginia history," Thomas said, reading from his phone. "Crane's company is finished. The board has already announced they're cooperating with investigators. And the properties. The families he destroyed. The Attorney General is talking about setting up a restitution fund, returning land that was stolen, compensating families for what they lost. Sarah nodded slowly. It was more than she'd dared to hope for, more than she'd allowed herself to imagine during the darkest days. "There's something else," Thomas said. "A reporter called. They want to interview you, tell your side of the story now that Crane's been arrested." "No." "No?" Sarah looked down at Grace at the tiny face that had become the center of her universe. "I've said everything I needed to say. The evidence speaks for itself now. What I want is to go back to being anonymous, to raise my daughter in peace, to protect this land the way my grandmother did quietly without cameras and headlines." "You might not have that choice. You're famous now, Sarah, the woman who brought down Richard Crane." "I'm not famous. I'm just stubborn." Sarah smiled despite herself. "And tired. Very, very tired." Thomas sat down beside her. "What are you going to do now?" Sarah thought about the question, about everything she'd been through since the day she'd received that letter at the shelter in Roanoke, about the house, the land, the aquifer, the generations of women who had protected it all. "I'm going to fix up this house," she said finally. "I'm going to plant a garden. I'm going to teach my daughter about the spring house and the water that flows beneath our feet. And someday when she's old enough, I'm going to tell her the whole story, about her great-grandmother, about Crane, about the fight we fought and why it mattered." "That sounds like a good life. It sounds like the only life I ever wanted." Sarah leaned back, feeling the exhaustion of the past weeks finally catching up with her. "My grandmother used to say that we don't choose our battles. They choose us. All we can do is show up and fight as hard as we can." "Did she ever say what happens after the fighting is done?" Sarah closed her eyes. "She said that's when the real work begins. Building something worth protecting. Raising children who understand why it matters. Passing on the knowledge and the responsibility to the next generation." Sounds like she was a wise woman. "She was the wisest person I ever knew, and I spent 17 years being too afraid to come back to her." Sarah's voice cracked. "I'll never forgive myself for that. She forgave you. She prepared a place for you and your daughter. She believed in you when you didn't even know you needed believing in." "I know. That's what makes it worse." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what, I think she knew exactly what she was doing. She knew you'd need to live your own life before you could appreciate what she was offering. She knew you'd have to lose everything before you could understand what you stood to gain." "You think she planned all of this?" "I think Grace Mitchell was playing a longer game than any of us understood, and I think she won." That night, Sarah carried Grace down to the spring house for the first time. The baby was only 3 weeks old, too young to understand anything she was seeing, but Sarah needed her to be there. Needed her to breathe the air of that ancient chamber, to hear the water flowing through darkness, to begin her life connected to the place that would someday be her responsibility. "This is the spring house," Sarah said softly, holding Grace close as they descended the stairs. "This is what your great-grandmother spent her whole life protecting. This is what I almost lost." The chamber glowed with its soft phosphorescent light. The pool shimmered eternal and unchanging. "Someday you'll understand what this place means. Someday you'll stand here and feel the weight of all the generations that came before you. And someday I hope you'll make the same choice they made. To protect, to preserve. To put something bigger than yourself ahead of everything else." Grace opened her eyes and looked at her mother. In the strange light of the spring house, her irises seemed to glow. "But not yet," Sarah said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "For now, you just need to grow, to learn, to be loved." She smiled through tears that wouldn't stop falling. "I promise you, little one. I promise you a childhood full of love, full of safety, full of all the things I didn't have when I was growing up." The water flowed on, patient and eternal. "Your great-grandmother is watching," Sarah whispered. "She's so proud of you, of both of us." She stayed in the spring house until Grace fell asleep, then climbed back up to the world above, to the house that was finally fully hers. The weeks that followed were quieter than Sarah had expected. The media attention faded as newer stories captured the public's imagination. The FBI investigation continued, but Sarah's involvement was minimal, now limited to occasional phone calls and document requests. Victoria's license was reinstated, and she returned to her practice with a reputation significantly enhanced by her role in bringing down Crane. Sarah focused on the farmhouse. She started with the kitchen, stripping away decades of makeshift repairs and restoring it to something close to its original condition. She found photographs from the 1920s in one of her grandmother's boxes and used them as a guide, matching colors and materials as closely as she could. Martha helped with the garden, teaching Sarah which plants would thrive in the mountain soil and which would struggle. Ellen continued her research into the history of the aquifer, compiling everything she'd learned into a book that she planned to publish the following year. And Thomas became a permanent fixture, moving into the guest room and taking on the role of unofficial grandfather to Grace. "You don't have to stay," Sarah told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I know, but where else would I go? This house has felt more like home in the past 6 months than anywhere I've lived in 50 years. "Why?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Because this is where Grace is. The other Grace, I mean. Your grandmother. Even after she died, I felt her here. In the walls, in the floors, in the way the house seems to breathe." He looked at Sarah. "And now you're here, and little Grace is here, and it's like the house is alive again. Like it was waiting for someone to love it properly. You loved my grandmother, didn't you?" Thomas didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I loved her for 30 years, never told her, never had the courage. By the time I worked up the nerve, she was already sick, and it seemed cruel to burden her with something she couldn't do anything about." "She knew." "What?" "She knew Thomas. There's a box in the attic, letters she wrote but never sent. Some of them are about you." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "She loved you too. She just didn't know how to say it." Thomas's eyes glistened. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I spent 17 years not saying things that mattered, not going places I should have gone, not being there for people who needed me." Sarah looked out at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. "I'm not doing that anymore. Life is too short and too precious to waste on silence." That night, Sarah found the letters and gave them to Thomas. She left him alone in the living room, reading words from a woman he'd loved, and lost words that should have been spoken decades ago but somehow still carried the power to heal. When she came back an hour later, he was crying. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for being here, for helping me, for being the family I needed when I had no one else. Your grandmother brought us together. Even from beyond the grave, she's still taking care of everyone she loved. That's who she was. That's who I want to be." The trial started in March. Sarah was called as a witness 3 times, traveling to the federal courthouse in Richmond to testify about what she'd found, what Crane had done, what her grandmother had spent her life protecting. The evidence was overwhelming. Former employees turned state's witness, providing detailed accounts of Crane's methods. Forensic accountants traced the money. Medical experts testified about the suspicious patterns in the deaths. By the time the prosecution rested, Crane's lawyers had already begun negotiating a plea deal. "He's going to prison," Victoria told Sarah after the final day of testimony. 25 to life minimum. He'll die in a cell." "Good." "You don't feel sorry for him?" "Even a little." Sarah thought about her grandmother dying alone in this house, about the families who had lost everything, about the water that had almost been destroyed, the lives that had almost been ruined. "No," she said, "I don't feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for his victims, and I feel grateful that he won't be able to create any more." The verdict came in June, guilty on all counts, 37 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Sarah watched the news coverage from her grandmother's living room, Grace playing on the floor beside her. "It's done," she said to the empty house. "It's finally done." The house creaked around her, settling, and Sarah could have sworn she heard her grandmother's voice, faint and far away. "Well done, sweetheart, well done." That evening, Sarah carried Grace down to the spring house one more time. The chamber was exactly as it had always been. The water glowed. The pool shimmers. The weight of centuries pressed against the walls. "We did it," Sarah said, kneeling at the edge of the pool. "We protected what you left us. The water is safe. The land is safe. Your great-granddaughter is safe." Grace reached out and touched the water with one tiny finger. She laughed at the cold. "Your great-great-great-great-grandmother discovered this place in 1852, Sarah told her. "Every generation since then has protected it, and now it passes to you." She kissed her daughter's cheek. "Not yet, not for many years, but someday, when you're ready." Grace splashed the water and laughed again. Sarah held her close and let the tears come. They had survived. They had won. And now finally they could begin the work of living. 3 years passed like water through stone, slow and steady and transformative. Grace took her first steps in the kitchen where 5 generations of Mitchell women had learned to walk. She spoke her first words on the porch where her great-grandmother had rocked and dreamed and planned. She grew from an infant into a toddler, into a small person with opinions and preferences and a stubborn streak that Sarah recognized all too well. "She's just like you," Thomas said one morning watching Grace refuse to eat her oatmeal for the third day in a row. Absolutely impossible to reason with. "She's just like my grandmother," Sarah corrected. "I was never this difficult." "That's not what Grace told me." Sarah laughed, something she did easily now, naturally, without the weight of fear pressing down on every moment. The farmhouse had been restored room by room with care and patience and money from the restitution fund that the federal government had established after Crane's conviction. The roof no longer leaked. The windows no longer rattled. The porch stood straight and proud, freshly painted in the barn blood red that Grace Mitchell had always insisted kept evil spirits away. The spring house remained unchanged, eternal, and patient, waiting for the day when another generation would descend those ancient stairs and understand what they were inheriting. But peace, Sarah was learning, was never permanent, and the past had a way of reaching forward when you least expected it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September, exactly 3 years after Sarah had first returned to Highland Springs. She was sorting mail at the kitchen table, Grace playing with blocks on the floor, when she saw the return address and felt her heart stop. Virginia Department of Corrections. Inmate correspondence. Richard Crane was writing to her from prison. Sarah stared at the envelope for a long moment, her hands trembling. She should throw it away. She should burn it without reading it. She should pretend it never arrived. Instead, she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell," the letter began. "I imagine you're surprised to hear from me. Perhaps you thought our business was concluded. Perhaps you believed that my conviction meant the end of our story. I'm writing to tell you that you were wrong." Sarah's stomach churned. She kept reading. "I've had 3 years to think about what happened. 3 years to consider my mistakes. 3 years to plan what comes next. And I've realized something important. I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again. I know things about your family that you don't know, Mrs. Mitchell. Secrets that your grandmother kept even from you. Secrets that could change everything you believe about the land you're protecting and the people you're protecting it from. If you want to know the truth, visit me. I'll be waiting." The letter was signed with Crane's full name and inmate number. Sarah read it 3 times. Then she carried it to the fireplace and watched it burn. "Who was that from?" Thomas asked, coming in from the garden. "No one important." Thomas studied her face. "You're lying." "I'm protecting you. There's a difference." "Sarah, after everything we've been through, don't you think I can handle whatever this is?" Sarah closed her eyes. She wanted to keep the letter a secret, to carry the burden alone the way her grandmother had carried so many burdens. But Thomas was right. They had been through too much together for secrets now. "Crane wrote to me, from prison. He says he knows things about my family, things my grandmother never told me." Thomas's expression darkened. "He's manipulating you, trying to get inside your head. It's what men like him do." "I know. That's why I burned the letter." "Good. Don't respond. Don't engage. Let him rot in his cell, wondering if you even read it." Sarah nodded. But that night, lying in bed while Grace slept peacefully in the next room, she couldn't stop thinking about Crane's words. Secrets that your grandmother kept. Things that could change everything. What if he was telling the truth? What if there was more to the story than she knew? The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This time, Sarah didn't open it. She threw it directly into the fire without reading a single word. The third letter came a week after that, and the fourth, and the fifth. Each one went into the flames unopened, unread, but their presence haunted her. Crane was trying to tell her something, and part of her desperately wanted to know what it was. "Maybe you should visit him, Martha said one afternoon. They were in the garden, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes, Grace playing nearby with Thomas. "Are you serious?" "I'm serious about putting this to rest. You've been jumping at shadows for weeks. Every time the mail comes, you look like you're going to be sick." Martha straightened up and wiped her hands on her apron. "Whatever Crane knows or thinks he knows, you need to hear it. Otherwise, it's going to eat you alive. And if it's just another manipulation, another way to hurt me, then at least you'll know. At least you can stop wondering." Sarah looked at her daughter, playing in the dirt, laughing at something Thomas had said. Grace was 3 years old now. She had her whole life ahead of her, a life that Sarah had nearly lost, had nearly sacrificed in the fight against Richard Crane. Did she really want to invite that darkness back in? "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for another week. Then she called Victoria. "You want to visit Richard Crane in prison?" Victoria's voice was incredulous. "Sarah, that's insane." "He keeps writing to me. He says he knows secrets about my family. I need to know if it's true." It's not true. It's a game. He's bored and bitter and looking for ways to hurt you from behind bars. Maybe, but what if there's something real? What if my grandmother was hiding something that I need to know? Victoria was silent for a long moment. If you do this, you're not going in alone. I'm coming with you. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I think this is a terrible idea, but if you're determined to walk into the lion's den, at least you should have backup. The visit was scheduled for the following Thursday. Sarah drove to Richmond the night before, staying in a hotel near the federal prison where Crane was serving his sentence. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Crane's face, heard his voice, felt the cold weight of his threats pressing down on her. At 8 o'clock the next morning, she walked through the prison gates with Victoria at her side. The processing took an hour. Metal detectors, pat-downs, form after form to sign. Sarah endured it all. She did all with growing dread, wondering what she was walking into, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Finally, they led her to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. A guard stood by the door, and across the table, wearing an orange jumpsuit and a smile that hadn't changed at all in 3 years, sat Richard Crane. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming." Sarah sat down slowly, her heart pounding. "I'm not here for small talk, Crane. Say what you have to say." "Direct as always. I've always admired that about you." Crane folded his hands on the table. "Tell me, have you ever wondered why your grandmother was so determined to protect that land? Why she spent her entire life fighting people like me?" "She was protecting the aquifer, protecting the water supply for 5 counties. Yes, that's the story she told, the noble narrative. But it's not the whole truth, is it?" Crane leaned forward. "Have you ever looked into your family's finances, Mrs. Mitchell? Ever wondered how a simple farm family managed to hold on to prime real estate for almost 200 years while everyone around them was selling off?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your family has been taking money for decades. Payments from mining companies, development corporations, anyone who wanted access to the resources under your land. Not to exploit them, of course, to ensure that no one else could." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Crane smiled wider. "I have documents, Mrs. Mitchell, records that your grandmother destroyed her copies of, but that I managed to preserve. Records showing that the Mitchell family has received over $4 million in the past 50 years paid by companies that wanted exclusive access to the mineral rights. Access that your family granted, then blocked, then sold again to the highest bidder." Sarah shook her head. "My grandmother would never—" "Your grandmother was a businesswoman, Mrs. Mitchell, a very clever one. She played both sides for decades, taking money from people like me while posing as the noble protector of the land." Crane's eyes glittered. "The conservation easement, it's not what you think. Read the fine print. There are exceptions, loopholes, ways to extract resources without technically violating the terms." "I don't believe you." "Then don't. But ask yourself this. How did a 91-year-old woman living alone on a failing farm afford to keep everything running, the taxes, the maintenance, the legal fees when people like me came calling?" Crane spread his hands. "Where do you think the money came from? Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room was spinning around her. "You're lying," she managed. "This is just another manipulation, another way to hurt me. Maybe, or maybe your grandmother wasn't the saint you've built her up to be. Maybe she was just as greedy and compromised as the rest of us." Crane stood up, signaling to the guard that the visit was over. "The documents are in a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Highland Springs. Box 1847. The key is hidden in your grandmother's house. She never got rid of it, even though she knew what it could prove. Why are you telling me this, dumb?" Crane paused at the door. "Because you took everything from me, Mrs. Mitchell. My company, my freedom, my future. And now I'm taking something from you, not your land, not your life, just your illusions." He smiled one last time. "Enjoy the truth. I hope it keeps you warm at night." The guard led him away. Sarah sat alone in the empty room, staring at the table, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. "Sarah?" Victoria touched her shoulder. "Sarah, are you okay?" "He's lying," Sarah said. "He has to be lying." "Of course he's lying. That's what he does." "But what if he's not? What if my grandmother was hiding something? What if everything I believed about her was wrong?" Victoria knelt beside her. "Listen to me. Whatever Crane said in there, whatever documents he claims to have, it doesn't change what you know about your grandmother. You knew her. You loved her. You know what kind of person she was." "Do I? I was gone for 17 years. I missed almost her entire life. What do I really know about what she did or didn't do?" Victoria had no answer for that. The drive back to Highland Springs was silent. Sarah stared out the window, watching the mountains roll past, trying to reconcile what Crane had told her with everything she believed about her grandmother. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be. But the doubt was there now, lodged in her chest like a splinter, and she knew it would fester until she found the truth. "I have to look," she said as they pulled into the farmhouse driveway. "Look for what?" "The key. The safety deposit box. Whatever Crane was talking about." "Sarah, this is exactly what he wants. He wants you to tear apart your grandmother's memory, looking for evidence that might not even exist." "Maybe, but I can't live with not knowing. I can't raise my daughter in this house telling her stories about her great-grandmother while wondering if those stories are lies." Victoria sighed. "Then let me help you. If there's something to find, we'll find it together." They searched the house for 3 days. Sarah went through every drawer, every closet, every box in the attic and basement. She searched places she'd already searched a dozen times, looked in corners she'd never thought to look before. On the 3rd day, she found it. The key was hidden in the root cellar behind a loose stone that Sarah had walked past 100 times without noticing. It was old and tarnished with a number etched into the metal 1847. Sarah held it in her palm, feeling its weight. The same number as the year the farmhouse was built. The same number as the safety deposit box Crane had mentioned. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said when she showed him what she'd found. "Whatever's in that box, it doesn't change who your grandmother was. It doesn't change what she meant to you." "Maybe not, but I need to know. I need to understand." The bank was quiet when Sarah walked in the next morning. She presented the key to the manager, explained that she was Grace Mitchell's heir, and waited while they verified her identity and retrieved the box. It was smaller than she'd expected. Old and battered with scratches on the lid that suggested it had been opened many times over the years. Sarah carried it to a private room and sat down. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely insert the key. The lid opened with a soft click. Inside were documents. Dozens of them. Contracts, receipts, correspondence dating back decades. Sarah read through them slowly, her heart sinking with every page. Crane had told the truth. There were payments. Large payments from companies Sarah recognized and companies she didn't, all for various consultation services and environmental assessments and other euphemisms for what they really were, bribes. Her grandmother had taken money from the very people she claimed to be fighting. She had sold access to the mineral rights, then blocked extraction, then sold the same access again to different buyers. She had played both sides for almost 50 years, accumulating millions of dollars while maintaining her public image as the noble protector of the land. Sarah found bank statements showing accounts in her grandmother's name. Accounts she'd never known existed with balances that made her head spin. She found letters from lawyers, from corporate executives, from government officials, all thanking Grace Mitchell for her cooperation and expressing hope that their mutually beneficial arrangement would continue. She found a handwritten note in her grandmother's familiar script, apparently a draft of a letter never sent. "I know what you think of me. I know you believe I'm corrupt, that I've betrayed everything our family stood for. But you don't understand. The money was never for me. It was for the land, for the protection. Fighting costs money, and I had none, so I took theirs and used it against them. I am not proud of what I've done, but I would do it again 1,000 times over to keep this place safe." Sarah read the note 3 times. Then she sat back and tried to process what she'd learned. Her grandmother hadn't been corrupt, not in the way Crane had implied. She'd been strategic, ruthless even. She'd used the weapons of her enemies against them, taken their money, and turned it into a fortress that protected the land for another generation. It wasn't the saintly narrative Sarah had believed, but it wasn't the villainy Crane had tried to paint either. It was something more complicated, more human, more real. Sarah gathered up the documents and carried them home. That night, after Grace was asleep and Thomas had retired to his room, Sarah sat on the porch and read through everything again. She thought about her grandmother alone in this house for so many years, fighting a war that no one else knew about. She thought about the choices Grace had made, the compromises, the sacrifices. She thought about what she herself might do if she were faced with the same impossible decisions. "I understand now," she said to the empty night. "I understand why you did what you did, and I forgive you. Not because you need forgiveness, but because I need to give it." The wind stirred the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Sarah closed her eyes and felt for the first time since Crane's letter had arrived a sense of peace. Her grandmother had been human, flawed and complicated, and doing the best she could with what she had, just like Sarah, just like everyone, and that somehow made her more worthy of love, not less. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She called Victoria and asked her to help set up a press conference. not to expose her grandmother's secrets, but to reveal them on her own terms. "Are you sure about this?" Victoria asked. "This information could damage your grandmother's reputation, could damage yours." "I know, but I'm tired of secrets. I'm tired of people using them as weapons against me." Sarah looked out the window, at the mountains, at the land her family had protected for almost 200 years. "My grandmother did what she had to do to save this place. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm proud of her. And I want the world to know the whole truth, not just the parts that make us look good." The press conference was held at the farmhouse on the same porch where Sarah had first seen Grace Mitchell's home after 17 years away. Reporters came from across the state. Some remembered the story from 3 years ago, the pregnant widow who had brought down Richard Crane. Others were new, drawn by the promise of fresh revelations about a case that had captivated the nation. Sarah stood before them, with Grace in her arms, and told them everything. She told them about Crane's letters, about the visit to prison, about the safety deposit box and the documents inside. She told them about her grandmother's deals, the money she'd taken, the complicated web of compromise and strategy that had kept the land safe for decades, and she told them why she was sharing it all now. "My grandmother was not perfect," Sarah said. "She made choices that some people would call wrong. She took money from people she was fighting. She played both sides of a conflict that lasted her entire adult life. But she did it for one reason and one reason only, to protect this land and the water that flows beneath it." She held up the note her grandmother had written, the draft letter that explained everything. "She wrote this probably intending to tell me someday, but she died before she could. And Richard Crane tried to use that against me. He tried to make me doubt everything I believed about my grandmother, about my family, about myself." Sarah looked directly into the cameras. "I'm not going to let him win. I'm not going to be ashamed of what my grandmother did. She saved this land. She protected the water supply for 5 counties. She fought an enemy with more money and more power and more resources than she could ever match, and she won. Yes, she made compromises. Yes, she got her hands dirty, but the land is still here. The water is still flowing. And my daughter will grow up in a house that has sheltered our family for almost 200 years. She kissed Grace's forehead. "That's what matters. That's the only thing that matters. And anyone who tries to use my grandmother's memory as a weapon against us should know we're not afraid of the truth. We never were." The coverage was mixed. Some outlets praised Sarah for her honesty, calling it a refreshing change from the sanitized narratives that usually surrounded public figures. Others criticized her for defending what they called corruption, arguing that her grandmother's deals undermined the very principles she claimed to protect. Sarah didn't care about any of it. She had told the truth. She had taken control of the narrative, and she had proven once again that the Mitchell women couldn't be broken by secrets or threats or manipulation. 3 months later, on the anniversary of Grace Mitchell's death, Sarah held a ceremony at the farmhouse. Friends and neighbors gathered on the lawn, the same people who had stood with her during the darkest days of the fight against Crane. Thomas spoke first, sharing memories of Grace that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure. Then Sarah stepped forward. 4 years ago, I came back to this place with nothing. I was homeless, pregnant, and alone. I didn't know about the aquifer, or the easement, or the generations of women who had protected this land before me. I didn't know what my grandmother had sacrificed to keep it safe." She looked at the house, at the mountains, at the sky that had watched over the Mitchell farm since before memory began. "Now I know everything, the good and the bad, the noble sacrifices and the dirty compromises, and I love this place more than ever, because I understand now that protection isn't always clean. Sometimes you have to make deals with devils to keep the things you love safe. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty." She picked up Grace, who had been playing at her feet. "This is my daughter, Grace Eleanor Mitchell. She's named for the woman who made all of this possible, and someday I'll tell her everything, the whole truth. Not just the parts that make our family look heroic, but the parts that make us human." Sarah kissed her daughter's cheek. "Because that's what legacy really means. Not a perfect story that inspires from a distance, but a complicated truth that teaches us how to live. My grandmother wasn't a saint. She was something better. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who did whatever it took to protect what mattered." She looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who had become her family over the past 4 years. "And that's what I want my daughter to learn. Not how to be perfect, but how to be strong. Not how to avoid compromise, but how to make the compromises that matter. Not how to live without secrets, but how to tell the truth when it counts." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence, everyone standing together, remembering Grace Mitchell and everything she had built. Afterwards, Sarah walked down to the spring house alone. The chamber was unchanged, eternal, the water flowing through darkness just as it had for thousands of years. Sarah knelt at the edge of the pool and dipped her fingers into the cold. "I know everything now," she said softly. "All of it. And I don't love you any less. Maybe I love you more, because now I understand what you went through, what you sacrificed, what it cost you to keep this place safe." The water glowed with its soft phosphorescent light. "I'm going to keep fighting, Grandma, for Grace, for the land, for everything you believed in, and when my time comes, I'll pass it on to her. The whole truth, the whole responsibility, the whole beautiful, complicated legacy." She stood and walked to the carved shelves along the wall where the documents and journals of nearly 200 years were stored. There was space for more. Space for her own journals, her own documents, her own records of the battles she'd fought and the choices she'd made. Sarah pulled out a blank notebook she'd brought with her and opened it to the first page. She began to write. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. This is my story, and the story of my grandmother, and the story of all the women who came before us. It is not a perfect story. It is not a simple story, but it is true and it is ours, and I am proud to add my chapter to a tale that began almost 200 years ago and will continue long after I am gone." She wrote for hours, filling page after page with everything she wanted her daughter to know. The truth about Crane, the truth about Grace, the truth about the deals and compromises and sacrifices that had kept this land safe. When she finished, she placed the notebook on the shelf beside her grandmother's journals. Then she climbed the stairs back to the world above, to the house and the family and the future that was waiting for her. The spring house kept its vigil in the darkness below, and the water flowed on. 7 years passed, and Grace Eleanor Mitchell grew into a child who carried the mountains in her bones. She was 10 years old now, with her mother's stubborn jaw and her great-grandmother's gray-green eyes. She knew the farmhouse the way other children knew their own bedrooms, every creaking board and drafty corner, every secret hiding spot and forgotten alcove. She knew the land too, the fields and forests and streams that had belonged to her family since before anyone alive could remember. But she did not yet know about the spring house. Sarah had been waiting for the right moment. Waiting for Grace to be old enough to understand, mature enough to carry the weight of what she would learn. Every year she thought about taking her daughter down those ancient stairs, showing her the glowing pool and the carved shelves and the accumulated secrets of almost 2 centuries. And every year she decided to wait just a little longer. Then Thomas got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, then shortness of breath, then a visit to the doctor that turned into more tests, more specialists, more grave faces delivering news that no one wanted to hear. "Lung cancer," Thomas told Sarah on a November afternoon, his voice steady despite the tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "Stage 4. They're saying 6 months, maybe less." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Thomas had been her rock for 10 years, her friend and protector, and the closest thing Grace had ever had to a grandfather. The thought of losing him was unbearable. "There has to be something," she finally managed. "Treatment, clinical trials, something." "There's nothing, Sarah. I've made my peace with it." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Tell Grace. About the spring house. About everything. Don't wait until it's too late like your grandmother did with you." His grip tightened. "I want to see her face when she understands. I want to know that the legacy is passing on before I go." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Tomorrow. I'll tell her tomorrow. Tonight. Life doesn't wait, Sarah. Neither should you." That evening after dinner, Sarah asked Grace to come for a walk. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, pulling on her jacket. "Somewhere special, somewhere I should have taken you a long time ago." They walked across the property in the fading light, mother and daughter following a path that Sarah had walked 100 times over the past decade. Grace chatted about school and friends and a boy in her class who had pulled her hair, oblivious to the weight of what was coming. When they reached the old oak tree, Sarah stopped. "Do you see this tree?" she asked. "Of course, it's the big one, the one with the swing. Your great-grandmother used to sit under this tree every evening watching the sun go down. She said it was her favorite place on the whole property." Sarah knelt and looked her daughter in the eyes. "But it's also hiding something. Something that our family has protected for almost 200 years. Grace's eyes widened. "What kind of something?" "Let me show you." Sarah pressed the hidden latch, and the panel in the tree swung open. Grace gasped at the sight of the stairs descending into darkness. "Is this a secret passage like in the movies?" "Better than that. This is your heritage." They descended together, Sarah holding Grace's hand, guiding her down the worn stone steps. The air grew cooler as they went deeper, and Grace pressed closer to her mother, suddenly uncertain. "It's okay," Sarah said. "You're safe, I promise." Then the passage opened up, and Grace saw the spring house for the first time. The glow stopped her in her tracks. The pool shimmering with phosphorescent light. The carved shelves lined with journals and documents. The weight of centuries pressing against the stone walls. "Mom," Grace whispered, "what is this place?" Sarah led her to the edge of the pool. "This is the spring house. The water you're looking at feeds every well in 5 counties. Thousands of families depend on it without ever knowing it exists. And our family protects it. Our family has protected it since 1852. Your great-great-great-great-grandmother found it. Every generation since then has kept it safe." Grace reached down and touched the water. Her fingers came away glowing faintly with phosphorescence. "It's magic," she breathed. "It's not magic. It's responsibility." Sarah sat down beside her daughter. "There's something I need to tell you, Grace. Something about our family and this land and why what we do here matters." She told Grace everything. She told her about Eleanor Mitchell, the first one who had discovered the spring with her husband in 1852. She told her about the mining companies and developers who had tried to buy the land for generations. She told her about Richard Crane and the fight that had nearly destroyed them both. She told her about her grandmother, Grace Eleanor Mitchell, who had died alone in the farmhouse waiting for Sarah to come home. She told her about the compromises and deals and dirty secrets that had kept the land safe. And she told her about Daniel, the father Grace had never known, who had died before his daughter was born, who would have loved her so much if he'd had the chance. Grace listened without interrupting, her eyes growing wider with each revelation. When Sarah finally finished, the chamber was silent except for the soft sound of water flowing through darkness. "That's a lot," Grace said finally. Sarah laughed despite herself. "Yes, it's a lot. And someday this will all be mine, the house, the land, this place. Someday, not for a long time, I hope, but yes, when I'm gone, you'll be the guardian." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if I don't want it?" Sarah felt her heart crack. "What do you mean? What if I want to be something else, a doctor or a teacher or, I don't know, something that isn't this?" Grace gestured at the spring house, at the weight of history pressing down on them both. "What if I want to leave like your mom did?" Sarah took her daughter's hands. "Then you leave. You live your life. You become whatever you want to become." "But the land will be here. It's been here for millions of years. It will survive whether we protect it or not." Sarah squeezed Grace's fingers. "I'm not going to force you to carry this burden, sweetheart. That's not how our family works. We choose to protect. We choose to stay. And if you choose something different, I'll love you just as much." "But you'll be disappointed." "I'll be proud of you for knowing your own heart." Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Your great-grandmother never pushed your mom to stay. She let her go even though it broke her heart, because she understood that you can't force someone to care about something. They have to find it themselves." Grace leaned against her mother, looking at the glowing pool. "I don't know what I want yet." "You're 10 years old. You're not supposed to know. You're supposed to explore and dream and figure out who you are." Sarah kissed the top of her head. "The spring house will be here when you're ready, and if you're never ready, that's okay too." "Really?" "Really." They sat together in the glow of the ancient chamber, mother and daughter, while above them the world turned toward darkness and the stars came out over the mountains. Thomas died 3 months later on a cold February night with snow falling soft and silent outside his window. Sarah was holding his hand when he went. Grace was asleep in the next room, too young to witness death, old enough to understand what it meant. "Tell her come," Thomas whispered in his final moments. "Tell her I loved her like she was my own." "I will. And tell her the spring house chose well. When it called you home. When it gave you grace." He smiled the same gentle smile he'd worn the first day he'd knocked on Sarah's door, with a casserole and a folder full of secrets. "You've done your grandmother proud, Sarah. You've done us all proud." "Thomas, it's okay. I'm ready. I've been ready for a long time." His grip tightened on her hand, then slowly relaxed. "The water will keep flowing. That's what matters. That's all that ever mattered." He closed his eyes and slipped away as quietly as the snow falling outside, as gently as the water flowing beneath the earth. Sarah wept until she had nothing left. Then she dried her eyes, squared her shoulders, and went to wake her daughter. "Thomas is gone," she said softly. "He passed a few minutes ago." Grace didn't cry. She just looked at her mother with eyes that seemed older than they should have been. "Did he say anything at the end?" "He said he loved you. He said the spring house chose well when it brought us home." Grace nodded slowly. "Can I see him?" "If you want to." They walked into Thomas's room together. He lay in his bed, peaceful, the lines of pain smoothed from his face. Grace approached slowly and took his hand, the one Sarah had been holding just moments before. "Thank you," Grace whispered, "for taking care of us, for being my grandpa when I didn't have one." Shh. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I'm going to miss you so much." Sarah watched her daughter say goodbye and felt something shift in her chest. Grace was growing up. Grace was becoming the kind of person who could face death with dignity and courage. Grace was becoming a Mitchell woman, whether she chose to accept the legacy or not. The funeral was held 3 days later. Half of Highland Springs turned out, along with people from neighboring towns and counties, people who had known Thomas during his years as deputy sheriff, people who had come to know him through his work with Sarah. Ellen spoke first, sharing stories from the years she'd spent researching the history of the aquifer. Martha spoke next, her voice breaking as she talked about the man who had become like a brother to her. Victoria came all the way from Richmond to pay her respects, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. Then Sarah stepped forward. "Thomas Harwell was not my family by blood," she said, "but he was my family in every way that matters. He was there when I came back to this place scared and alone and pregnant with a daughter I didn't know how to raise. He was there when Richard Crane tried to destroy us. He was there through every battle, every setback, every victory." She looked at the casket at the man who had given her so much. "He used to say that he stayed because the house needed him, because my grandmother needed him, because I needed him, but I think the truth is simpler than that. I think Thomas stayed because he loved. He loved this land. He loved this community. He loved my grandmother even if he never told her. And he loved me and Grace even though we came into his life when he thought his story was already over." Sarah wiped her eyes. "The spring house is still down there under the earth, keeping its ancient vigil. The water is still flowing. And somewhere I believe Thomas is watching, making sure we're all okay." She smiled through her tears. "Rest now, old friend. You've earned it. We'll take it from here." After the funeral, Sarah found Grace standing alone by Thomas's grave. "You okay?" she asked. "I've been thinking about what you said, in the spring house. About what? About choosing, about how you can't force someone to care about something." Grace looked up at her mother. "I think I understand now. Why you stayed. Why Thomas stayed. Why great-grandma spent her whole life fighting for this place. Why? Because it matters. Not just the water or the land or the history, but the people, the families who depend on wells they don't even know about, the community that would die without the aquifer." Grace's voice was steady, mature beyond her years. "It's not just about us, it's about everyone." Sarah put her arm around her daughter. "Your great-grandmother would be so proud of you." "I'm going to do it," Grace said. "I'm going to learn everything. The history, the science, the legal stuff, all of it. And when I'm old enough, I'm going to take over. I'm going to be the guardian." "You don't have to decide that now." "I know, but I want to." Grace looked at her mother with eyes that held the weight of all the generations that had come before. "This is my home. This is my family. And I'm not going to let anyone take it away." Sarah pulled her daughter close and held her tight. "Then we'd better get started on your education." The years that followed were the happiest of Sarah's life. She taught Grace everything she knew about the land, the water, the endless vigilance required to keep them safe. They walked the property lines together, checking fences and monitoring wells and documenting any changes in the water table. They spent hours in the spring house reading through journals that dated back almost 2 centuries, learning the stories of women who had faced challenges Sarah couldn't imagine and survived. Grace grew from a child into a teenager, stubborn and brilliant and more like her great-grandmother every day. She won science fairs with projects about aquifer conservation. She wrote essays about environmental protection that got published in state newspapers. She gave presentations at county meetings, standing before adults 3 times her age, and explaining why the land beneath their feet mattered more than any development deal. When Grace turned 16, Sarah took her to visit Richard Crane in prison. "Why?" Grace asked as they drove toward the federal facility. "Because you need to understand what you're fighting against. You need to see the face of the enemy so you'll recognize it when it comes again." "You think someone like Crane will come again?" "There's always another Crane. Someone with money and power and no conscience. Someone who sees the land as a resource to exploit instead of a trust to protect." Sarah glanced at her daughter. "You need to be ready." Crane was older now, a grayer diminished by years behind bars, but his eyes were the same cold and calculating, watching them with an interest that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Mrs. Mitchell, and this must be the famous Grace." Crane smiled his predator's smile. "You've grown?" "And you've gotten old," Grace said. "Prison doesn't seem to agree with you." Crane's smile faltered. "You have your mother's spirit and your great-grandmother's mouth." "I have my own mouth, thank you, and I came here to tell you something." "Oh, and what's that?" Grace leaned forward, her eyes locked on Crane's. "You tried to destroy my family. You killed people. You lied and cheated and manipulated, and you lost. You lost to a pregnant woman with no money and no power and no friends. You lost to my mother. Your mother got lucky. My mother got justice. There's a difference." Grace stood up. "I'm going to graduate from college in 6 years. Then I'm going to law school. Then I'm coming home to take over the protection of our land. And I want you to know that whatever time you have left, whatever you do when you get out, I'll be waiting. I'll be ready, and I will never ever let someone like you win." She turned and walked out without looking back. Sarah followed, her heart swelling with pride. "That was impressive," she said when they reached the parking lot. "I've been practicing," Grace admitted, "in the mirror for weeks." Sarah laughed. "Well, it worked. Did you see his face?" "He looked scared, for just a second." "Good. He should be scared." Sarah put her arm around her daughter. "You're going to be an amazing guardian, Grace. Better than me, better than your great-grandmother, better than any of us." "I had good teachers." Richard Crane died in prison 2 years later. Sarah heard about it on the news, a brief mention buried in the middle of a broadcast hardly noticed by a world that had moved on to newer scandals. She thought about the man who had tried to destroy her family, the man who had killed her grandmother and so many others, the man who had represented everything she'd spent her life fighting against. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel relief. She felt nothing at all. "It's over," she said to the empty kitchen. "It's finally over." But of course it wasn't over. It would never be over. There would always be another threat, another challenge, another battle to fight. The next one came 6 months later. A new company. Different name, different faces, same intentions. They wanted to build a natural gas pipeline through Highland County, a route that would take it directly under the Mitchell property. The environmental impact assessments were questionable. The promises of jobs and economic development were familiar. The pressure on local officials was intense. Sarah prepared to fight just as she'd fought before. But this time she wasn't alone. Grace came home from college for the summer, bringing with her a team of environmental science students who wanted to study the aquifer. They documented everything, created detailed models of the water flow, produced a report that made the case for protection in language that scientists and politicians could understand. Ellen published her book about the history of the aquifer, generating national attention for the conservation effort. Martha organized the business community, showing that sustainable tourism and agriculture brought more long-term revenue than any pipeline ever could. Victoria filed legal challenges that tied up the pipeline company in court for months. And at the center of it all stood Sarah, no longer the desperate pregnant woman who had stumbled onto this land a decade and a half ago, but a seasoned fighter who knew exactly how to win. The pipeline company withdrew their proposal in the spring. "You did it," Grace said when the news came through. "You beat them again." "We did it," Sarah corrected, "all of us, together." "But you led. You always lead." Sarah shook her head. "I won't always be here, Grace. Someday soon it's going to be your turn to lead. I'm just preparing the way." Grace graduated from college the following year, summa cum laude, with a degree in environmental science and a minor in political science. She gave the valedictorian speech talking about water and responsibility and the sacred duty that each generation owed to the next. Sarah sat in the audience with tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter become the woman she was always meant to be. 3 years after that, Grace graduated from law school. 2 years after that, she passed the bar exam on her first try. And 1 year after that, she came home to Highland Springs to begin her work as the newest guardian of the Mitchell legacy. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked on Grace's first morning back. "I've been ready my whole life." "It won't be easy. It never is." "I know, but I have good examples to follow." Grace took her mother's hand. "Will you show me the spring house again one more time before I officially take over?" They walked to the old oak tree together, mother and daughter, just as they had 15 years before. The path was the same, worn smooth by generations of feet. The tree was the same, ancient and patient. The hidden door was the same, opening onto darkness that led to light. They descended together, their footsteps echoing on the worn stone stairs. The spring house was unchanged, eternal, the water glowing softly in the phosphorescent light. Grace walked to the edge of the pool and knelt just as she had as a 10-year-old girl, touching the water with reverent fingers. "I used to think this place was magic," she said softly. "Now I know it's something better. It's real, it's precious, and it's ours to protect." Sarah stood behind her daughter, watching, remembering all the times she had knelt in this same spot, asking the water for guidance and courage and strength. "Your great-grandmother stood here," she said, "and her mother before her, and her mother before that, all the way back to Eleanor, who found this place in 1852 and understood what it meant. And now it's my turn. Now it's your turn." Grace stood and turned to face her mother. "What if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough?" "You won't fail, and you're stronger than you know." Sarah pulled her daughter into an embrace. "But even if you do fail, even if everything falls apart, you'll still be my daughter. You'll still be a Mitchell. You'll still be loved." That's what Great-Grandma would have said. That's what she did say, to me, when I was standing where you're standing now, wondering if I could carry this burden. Sarah stepped back and looked at her daughter with pride that filled her entire being. She was right, and so am I. You're ready, Grace. You've been ready for a long time. Grace wiped her eyes. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart. More than water, more than land, more than any legacy, no matter how old." They stood together in the glow of the spring house, the place where everything had begun and everything continued, the heart of a family that had protected this land for almost 200 years and would protect it for 200 more. The ceremony was held on the anniversary of Grace Mitchell's death, exactly 17 years after Sarah had first returned to Highland Springs. The whole town turned out, along with journalists and scientists and politicians who wanted to witness the formal establishment of the Grace Eleanor Mitchell Conservation Trust. The trust would permanently protect the aquifer, ensuring that no future developer or corporation could ever threaten the water supply again. Sarah spoke first, telling the story that she had told so many times before, but that still moved her every time she told it. "My grandmother spent her whole life protecting this land," she said. "She fought battles that no one knew about. She made sacrifices that no one understood, and when she died, she left everything to me, trusting that I would carry on her work." She looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who had become her family over almost 2 decades. "I came back to this place with nothing. A pregnant woman homeless, alone, with no idea what I was inheriting or why it mattered. But I learned, I fought, I survived, and now I'm passing the torch to my daughter, just as my grandmother passed it to me." Sarah turned to Grace, who stood beside her in a blue dress that matched her great-grandmother's eyes. "This is Grace Eleanor Mitchell. She was born in the same room where her great-grandmother was born. She was raised on this land surrounded by its history and its secrets, and she has chosen of her own free will to become its guardian." Grace stepped forward. "I didn't choose this land," she said. "It chose me. It chose my mother. It chose my great-grandmother. And it chose all the women who came before us, going back almost 200 years. She looked at the mountains, at the fields, at the house that had sheltered her family through war and depression and every challenge history could throw at it. Today we're making that choice permanent. The Grace Eleanor Mitchell Conservation Trust will protect the aquifer forever. No one will ever be able to drain it or poison it or destroy it for profit. The water that has flowed through this valley since before humans walked the earth will keep flowing for generations to come." Grace turned back to the crowd. "My mother taught me that protection isn't just about fighting enemies. It's about building something that lasts, something that endures, something that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren can inherit and be proud of." She took Sarah's hand. "This trust is named for my great-grandmother Grace Eleanor Mitchell, but it belongs to everyone who has ever drunk water from a well in this county, everyone who has ever farmed this soil, everyone who has ever looked at these mountains and felt something ancient and sacred stirring in their heart." Grace squeezed her mother's fingers. "We protect this place because it matters, because the water matters, because the land matters, because what we do today will echo through centuries we'll never live to see." She raised her voice, letting it carry across the crowd. "I am Grace Eleanor Mitchell. I am the guardian of this land, and I will protect it with everything I have for as long as I live, just as my mother did, just as my great-grandmother did, just as every Mitchell woman has done since Eleanor first looked at this valley and knew that she had found home." The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Politicians shook hands and made speeches about conservation and legacy and the importance of protecting natural resources. But Sarah barely noticed any of it. She was watching her daughter, this woman who had grown from the baby she'd carried into battle against Richard Crane, who had learned and trained and prepared her whole life for this moment. Grace caught her eye and smiled. Sarah smiled back. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. That evening, after the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, Sarah walked down to the spring house alone. She descended the familiar stairs, her steps slower now than they had been 17 years ago, but still steady, still sure. The chamber, the welcome to her with its soft glow, unchanged and unchanging, as eternal as the water that flowed through it. Sarah knelt at the edge of the pool and dipped her fingers into the cold. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered. "We protected what you left us. The trust is established. Grace is ready. The water will keep flowing long after we're all gone." She closed her eyes and felt the presence of all the women who had knelt in this same spot over almost 2 centuries. Eleanor, who had found this place and understood what it meant. Her daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter, each one carrying the torch forward. Grace Mitchell, who had spent 91 years fighting battles that no one knew about. And now Sarah herself adding her chapter to a story that would never truly end. "I understand now," she said, "why you did what you did, why you made the choices you made. You weren't just protecting water or land or even family. You were protecting possibility. The possibility that future generations would have the chance to live and grow and thrive on this land just as past generations had." She opened her eyes and looked at the glowing pool. "I'm going to step back now. Let Grace lead. Let her fight the battles that are coming. But I'll be here, watching, waiting, ready to help if she needs me." Sarah stood slowly, her knees protesting after years of hard work and harder choices. "Thank you," she said, to the spring house, to her grandmother's memory, to the water that had given her family purpose for almost 2 centuries. "Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for everything." She climbed the stairs back to the world above. Grace was waiting at the top, silhouetted against the evening sky. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. "One last visit, to say goodbye to the old chapter before the new one begins." "It's not goodbye, Mom. You'll be back. We'll be back together many times." "I know, but it feels different now." Sarah looked at her daughter, at the woman who would carry the legacy forward. "It's yours now, really yours. I'm just the backup." "You're not backup. You're foundation." Grace took her mother's hand. "Everything I am, everything I know, everything I believe about this land and why it matters, I learned from you. That doesn't go away just because there's a new guardian." Sarah squeezed her daughter's fingers. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher." They walked back to the farmhouse together, mother and daughter, as the sun set over the mountains and the stars began to emerge one by one. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of dinner that Grace had prepared before the ceremony. They ate together at the same kitchen table where Sarah had sat with Thomas on her first day back, the same table where generations of Mitchells had shared meals and made plans and celebrated victories. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they cleared the dishes. "Now we live, we protect, we wait for the next challenge and face it together." Grace smiled. "Same as always. Same as always." That night, Sarah dreamed of water. She was standing in the spring house, but it was different somehow. Larger. Older. The pool stretched back into infinity, and along its edges stood women she recognized and women she didn't, generations of Mitchells going back to the beginning and forward to some future she couldn't imagine. They were all looking at her. "You did well," said a voice she knew, a voice she hadn't heard in almost 20 years. Her grandmother stepped forward from the crowd, young and strong, the way she must have looked before Sarah was born. "You protected what we left you. You passed it on." "I tried," Sarah said. "I did the best I could." "That's all any of us can do." Her grandmother smiled, the same smile that Sarah remembered from childhood summers, from stolen visits, from a love that had survived 17 years of separation. "The water will keep flowing. That's what matters. That's all that ever mattered." "I miss you," Sarah whispered. "I miss you so much." "I know, but I'm not gone. Not really. I'm in the water and the land and the house. I'm in Grace and in you and in everyone who will come after." Her grandmother reached out and touched Sarah's cheek. "We don't die, Sarah. Not as long as the spring keeps flowing. We just become part of something larger, something eternal. Will I see you again? You'll see me every time you look at the mountains, every time you drink water from the well, every time Grace does something that reminds you of me." Her grandmother began to fade, becoming transparent, becoming light. "Live well, sweetheart. Love well. Protect what matters. And when your time comes, join us in the water. We'll be waiting." She was gone. Sarah woke with tears on her face and peace in her heart. She lay in bed for a long moment, listening to the house settle around her, feeling the presence of all the women who had slept in this room before her. Then she got up, got dressed, and went downstairs to start another day. Grace was already in the kitchen making coffee, humming a tune that Sarah recognized from her own childhood. "Sleep well?" Grace asked. "Better than I have in years." "Good dreams?" Sarah smiled. "The best." They sat together at the kitchen table, mother and daughter, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the mountains. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Sarah asked. "Ready as I'll ever be." Grace lifted her cup. "To the Mitchell women, past, present, and future." "To the Mitchell women," Sarah echoed, "and to the water that flows beneath our feet, keeping its ancient promise century after century." They clinked cups and drank. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The mountains stood eternal and patient. The farmhouse creaked softly, settling into another day of its long existence. And beneath it all, deep in the darkness where no light had ever reached, the spring kept flowing. It had flowed for 10,000 years. It would flow for 10,000 more. Not because it had to, because the Mitchell women had chosen to protect it. Because some things matter more than money. Because some legacies are measured not in what you take, but in what you guard. Because home is not just a place you live, but a promise you keep. Because the water that gives life must be protected by those who understand its worth. And because in the end, we are all just guardians of something larger than ourselves, stewards of a world we didn't create and will not live to see completed, passing the torch from generation to generation, keeping the flame alive against the darkness. That is what it means to be a Mitchell. That is what it means to protect. That is what it means to love something enough to fight for it, sacrifice for it, and pass it on. The spring house stands. The water flows. The legacy continues. And somewhere in a farmhouse that has sheltered the same family for almost 200 years, a mother and daughter drink their morning coffee and prepare to face whatever comes next. Together. Always together. That is the end of this story. But it is not the end of the story. Because stories like this never truly end. They just become part of the water, flowing through darkness, waiting for the next generation to discover them and carry them forward into a future we cannot imagine but must believe in. Believe in the water, believe in the land, believe in the families who protect them, and believe above all else that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost, no matter how long, no matter what.